followed by the first session on designing an effective carbon market for India from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. After lunch, we will resume at 2 with our second session on international perspectives towards a new global market regime that will touch upon key aspects that are important to the G20 and India, like voluntary markets, Article 6, and the carbon border adjustment mechanism. The question and answer session for each discussion will be held after the panel discussion is over. We're also live streaming this event on YouTube, and online participants can share their questions in the live comment section of the YouTube live stream or by posting them on Twitter and tagging WRI-India. And we are monitoring both of them and will reply to your questions as soon as possible. I would also request everybody present in the room to put your phones on silent. And lastly, the fire exits are present outside. There are signs right here at the back of this room. Outside there's one sign, there's one at the end, and there's one on the other side of the glass door behind over here. And without further ado, I would like to invite Ulka Kelkar, the Director of the Climate Program at WRI-India, to open the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to all of you who are present with us in the room today, as well as many others who have joined online from around the country. Today's event is actually something that we're doing in partnership with the Confederation of Indian Industry, which hosts the Secretariat of the Business 20 Engagement Group of India's G20 presidency. I'm also representing here today the Think Tank 20 Engagement Group of the G20 presidency. So very, very proud that this is a joint B20, T20 convening. So I really thank them on behalf of WRI India. We would also like to particularly mention MacArthur Foundation for their continuous support for studies such as this one, and particularly, most importantly, the participating companies. Because when we first conceptualized this study, we ourselves weren't sure what shape it would take, how we would execute it. But it was because of the time and the dedication with which these companies participated over the course of a pandemic year, when clearly they had many other priorities on their minds, that we have these insights to share with you today. And we're very glad that many of these participating companies are in the room with us today. I'd like to thank all the speakers. Particularly, we're very honored to have Director General of Bureau of Energy Efficiency, Mr. Abhay Bhakre. Today is BE's Foundation Day in Delhi, so he could not be here in person, but he has somehow been kind enough to take out time out of his busy schedule to join this event today, which just shows the importance of BE to this carbon market that is coming in India, and the commitment that the agency has to participating with industry and with research institutions like ours to make sure that the carbon market design is robust. I also thank to Mr. Ravi Pandit, who is on our board, again for making the trip from Pune to be with us today, and for the always insightful and pertinent questions that he asks about our research. Just to thank all the speakers who are here today, but just to make a special mention of my colleague Ashwini Hingne, who conceptualized the study and who's executed it with her team, many of whom are present here today. I won't preempt the discussions that you will hear today, but I just wanted to make two remarks about carbon markets in general. I'm an economist, so for us, a market-based mechanism like carbon trading is a very interesting tool. As long as you have a good quantity cap, this kind of tool can reduce costs. But it's always important to remember that in the fight against climate change, carbon trading or market-based instruments are only one weapon in our arsenal. They have to go hand in hand with other regulatory and other mechanisms. So as long as we have the right robust design, we make sure that there's compliance, and we take care of competitiveness concerns. And you'll hear about all three of these today: design, compliance, and competitiveness. Then we can make sure that this is a robust instrument that helps us and gives us more confidence. In fact, I would go so far as to say, given that all the kind of media coverage sometimes that we hear about corporate greenwashing, I think it is really our responsibility jointly to make sure that we have a very good market design, because that is almost the difference between hope and cynicism among the larger public about the fight against climate change. If we have a good market design and we have good targets and trading, then people will feel more confident that we can do more. Otherwise, there is this tendency to lapse into cynicism. So with that, with those sort of general remarks, let me hand over back to Shubhangi who will invite Bureau of Energy Efficiency DG, Mr. Bhakre, to give his inaugural remarks.
Mr. Abhay Bhakre is the Director General of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, the nodal agency in charge of designing and implementing India's national carbon market. And previously, he has more than 3 decades of experience in energy conservation in different industries, including petroleum. Mr. Bhakre, on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning to all. It's my pleasure to share my views and participate in this today's workshop on B20. So first of all, let me compliment WRI and CII for hosting this workshop as part of the B20. CII is working as a B20 secretariat, and Ministry of Power, we are actually leading the energy transition working group. I have been personally associated with the G20 agenda in 2018. So this is the 6th TTWG, and today's topic on carbon markets, and definitely a country like India and of course most of the other countries who are now striving hard to meet our NDCs, meet our long-term strategies, and also making sure that the complete Earth gets into the net zero around mid-century. Coming back to the G20 and the G20 part, the carbon market is actually, we can say, one of the series of initiatives or the interventions, if may say, which have been there for the last more than 1 decade in India and also in many other countries like EU. It has started in 2005. India also started last decade or so, and very recently the China. So these are the international markets. I am sure there is a list of very eminent panelists here who will be deliberating on that. But if we come back to a country like India, and when we talk about developing country, other countries, our emissions are actually growing, and they will continue to grow for some few more decades, I may say. And we are expecting every developing country to grow, and for growing, we are expecting them to use energy wisely, try to shift as much as possible to non-fossil fuel. That's what our aim is. So make sure that even if we consume energy, the resultant GHG emissions are as less as possible, or they can be optimized. So in this regard, there is a stark difference between the developed countries who have set their targets, whether it's part of NDCs or beyond, for absolute reduction, as you all know. Whereas in terms of emission intensity, the developing countries have set their targets. But it doesn't mean that we are allowed to discriminately use fossil fuel and the atmosphere. So in this regard, when a series of interventions have been done, and what we call altogether the energy transition initiatives or the efforts, in this regard, carbon market are putting actually a very effective tool. In most of the countries, and especially I am talking about the developing countries like India, the low-hanging fruits can be achieved initially with the help of energy efficiency aspects. And in this regard, from Bureau, we have been running many programs. But India has really done well, and in fact, industry partners are there. And most of them have really put a lot of efforts to make sure that at least the low-hanging fruits in terms of energy efficiency have been hit. Now, in this regard, we have 2 essential market mechanisms already running for the last almost more than a decade now, 10 to 12 years. One is the PAT mechanism, as most of you are aware. In that case, the target was on the energy efficiency or the specific energy efficiency improvement, but the mechanism more or less similar to the carbon markets. But the limitation was that it was only getting into the obligated entities, and it was basically in terms of the energy savings. So there was no kind of incentive for switching to cleaner fuel or even switching to the renewables. On the other hand, we had this renewable energy certificate, which is the part of the RPO obligation. So that market was also running in parallel. Over the years, when the economy is maturing, the efforts have really come to a much higher stage. Now there was a need felt, and when we analyze most of the other markets in the world, that now if we want to get into more aggressive efforts on reducing emissions, I think the most cost-effective tool is the carbon market. So in that regard, building upon the success and the capacity already available with the industry and other establishments in terms of PAT market and the REC market, and moving further to reduce our cost, carbon market in India was considered imminent in that case. Now, in that regard, the first thing which we thought that why both the previous markets have been successful, there was a strong legislative backup. So that backup basically came from Energy Conservation Act and the Electricity Act. My apologies. I'm getting message that my perhaps voice may be breaking, but that may be because of the internet connection. So the first thing what our Ministry of Power and Bureau decided that almost last 2 years, we wanted to have the necessary amendments and the empowerments to the central government so that we can put in place a very, very robust framework for the country. And in that case, we had discussed with and we have analyzed the similar mechanism around the world. We had discussed the possibilities of joining Indian market into Corsia. We had also discussed how it can be actually at par with Korea or even EU ETS. So all this put together, we got a very effective amendment to the Energy Conservation Act. So that is the first but most important step which has been taken. In parallel, we had a series of stakeholder consultation. I'm sure most of you have already attended. So that was the building block, how the carbon market was actually envisaged. We don't want to lose the good knowledge and the capacity already gained in terms of PAT and REC, but want to make it more comprehensive. Now, how do we really leverage the benefits from carbon market, especially in India? First thing is that once the commodity or the currency, if we talk about, has been converted into rupees, then the responsibility the purchaser as well as seller. So in that regard, the mechanism will be again classically it will be divided into two major parts. One is the voluntary kind or the offset kind of mechanism, and the other one could be the compliance mechanism. Since we were already running the compliance mechanism, it is easy to switch to a compliance mechanism subject to whatever quality checks and subject to setting up the targets in a more scientific manner. So that's the challenge, but we are already working on that, and I'm sure we'll get these things in gradually in next 1 or 2 years. Hello, can you hear me now? Hello.
Yes, please, we can hear you.
Yeah, my apologies. I think there was a drop in the network. So as I was mentioning that now there is a single metric which we can offer to the entire industry, both from voluntary side, from the compliance side, and we will make sure that the Indian market comes out with all kinds of protocol which are at par with the international mechanisms. We will also now make sure that there is enough capacity, and this is the next point which we are actually trying to focus. We want to make sure that our accredited energy auditors and the DOE, the designated operating entities, as per the CDM, we try to make a pool of carbon verifiers that will be once it is getting the. I'll just try to switch off my video. So once we try to have a pool of verifiers, so that will give more confidence for registration of the project. We are already preparing a robust electronic platform where the registration of projects and all the credit and the carbon credits can be managed. It will be similar lines what we had in the PAT. Now talking about how do we really further benefit our industry and make sure that this is at par with the international norms. So we are in closely touch, and we are guided by Ministry of Environment as well in terms of Article 6, both in terms of 6.2 or 6.4. And we are getting all the directions and the further discussions which is happening in UNFCC in terms of Article 6. So those things we will continue to make sure that our market or our mechanism is at par with and compliant to all such requirements also, so that then Ministry of Environment can take a call in the government that how many projects or what is the and the corresponding adjustment that can happen. So So all these provisions, we are planning to keep it in our market. And I'm sure that the industry will be really excited to join all the conversations, all the discussions. But I'm sure very soon we will be having a very strong market. And perhaps by end of this decade, by 2030, Indian carbon market will be one of the leading markets in the world. And it will benefit not only for the country's targets on achieving reduction in the GHG emission, at the same time, it will get a lot of investments, the low cost emission reductions, and good opportunities for the industries, the technology provider, and all other consultants in this regard. So I'll be very keen to listen to all other experts who will be really a relevant topic and allowing me to share my views. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bakre, for your remarks and insights into India's national carbon market. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Ravi Pandit, who is the chairman and founder of KPIT. He's passionate about technology, social policy, and is on the board and a founder of multiple NGOs, including the board of WRI-India. Thank you very much, sir, for taking the time to be with us today.
Good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And as I see, it's an amalgam of people from the government, and we just heard Mr. Bakre. Clearly, there are people from various think tanks, and of course, there are people from the industry. I mean, that accounts for the G20 and the T20 and the B20. And it seems that since there are a lot of people from the industry, I'll start with what the industry can and has been doing. I believe that since the Industrial Revolution, and especially in the last 80 years or so, so much has been done by private enterprise to change the face of the world. I think because of this whole area of free enterprise, over the last few decades, I think global prosperity levels have changed dramatically. I think the private industry has done enormous work in bringing millions of people, above the poverty lines, and the work that China has done in the last few years, and now India has been doing, is actually phenomenal. Globally, the people's incomes have gone up, their health levels have gone up, longevity has gone up, and all these are actually a tremendous tribute to what work has been done, I think, by private enterprise. However, what has been missed out during this period is the impact on what you can very broadly say as global commons. I think this whole industrial activity has seriously damaged the global commons. And these global commons include diversity and, of course, climate. And I think those are the areas which now cry for attention, because we are now at the cusp or at the brink of something, unless we make a big change in the way in which we operate, I think we might be putting the entire humanity at some risk. And I think in this context, the work that is being done, beginning with climate, beginning with especially that one part of climate, which is probably the most impactful, which is carbon. Beginning with that, I think, is a very, very important area. And this is required for all of us, for our future generations. So the question is, how do we ensure that while we keep the prosperity engine running, we ensure that the global commons don't get damaged? How do we ensure that we change the picture of the environment or climate as we see ourselves in today? So I think G20 has an enormous role to play in that, because if you look at globally, almost like 80% of GDP and maybe 75-80% of carbon emissions come from this group. So this group has a huge role to play. And of course, there is this great appreciation of the fact that work needs to be done here. Now, working with the think tanks and working with the business in the context of the G20, we have to see how we address this problem. And obviously, there are multiple mechanisms to do it. And as Ulka mentioned in her earlier comments, that emission trading schemes or systems are one of the many options available to make a change in the damage to the global commons. And today we are talking about carbon trading, and I personally believe that that is probably the most efficient, the most effective way of addressing the issue of carbon. Our study has shown that if we go by the carbon trading route, we can reduce the cost of this mitigation by almost 50%. And that is clearly because, this will bring into play all those people who can bring down the level of CO2 in the atmosphere in the most cost efficient way. So how can you make it more cost efficient is a critical thing. And in this, looking at this as a major area of work, we at WRI has been running this project with quite a few of you to see how can we come up with a good carbon market which is cost efficient and which is also highly result oriented. Because again, I think we are at this thin line of ensuring that we get results, but we don't generate cynicism. So how do we make sure that people have faith in this exercise and we actually get results? Because if you look at the current conversations about this, there is all this talk about greenwashing, which is really skepticism or cynicism coming about people wanting to show that they are doing things which they are probably actually not doing. So how do we make this transparent? How do we make it efficient? How do we make it clearly result-oriented is a challenge that all of us have to address. I believe defining the ground rules for this, defining the way in which GHG will be accounted, defining how we do the management of that, and to a large extent, or probably more important than anything else, how do we build a capacity to run this properly is an issue that we need to address. And I personally believe, and I represent industry apart from representing WRI here, I think we from the industry have a huge role to play. And I think in those areas where industry has been engaged, it has been engaged with proper guardrails put in, industry has shown good results. And I think this is an area where industry can show good results. We are probably at the most opportune time in addressing this. Because today, if we were to look at the interest of the investors are closely aligned towards good investment and good operations. If you look at customers, globally consumers do want to give now a preference to something which is climate sensitive. We find that quite a few cases, even employees want to join companies who are sensitive to the environment. So I think all the stars are kind of well aligned. This is the right time, but we need to come out with a mechanism which is really ensures that with transparency we get good results. And I think a good carbon market is something that can really do that. We at WRI are closely, very dearly committed to it. We have done the initial project of which I think some of you have been members. And we really look forward to coming out in consultation with what the BE is doing and in consultation with what the other NGOs are working on. We really want to come up with a mechanism where we can see a quick change happening. I believe that this is the time to act because I think the door might close unless we do a substantial work in the next few years. And I believe that this is the time that all of us need to put our heads and hands together to make that work. I'm particularly happy that so many of you are present here in person and on the call to take this discussion forward because this is probably the most critical area in which we as humanity will work. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pandit. I would now like to invite our next keynote speaker, Dr. Riza Swarga. He is the chairman of the Indonesia Carbon Trade Association and is on the expert board of the Technical Committee for Environment Friendly Technology Verification, Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Republic of Indonesia. He also played a key role during Indonesia's G20 presidency last year, including on carbon markets. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Swarga.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Namaste. Excellencies, Director General Bakri, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Chair and Co-Chair. First of all, I would like to apologize for not being able to join offline, be in Mumbai today because of other conflicting agenda. I was enjoying myself 2 months ago during the inception meeting in Gujarat. It was a wonderful place, and I really like to be there again in India. So let me also rephrase and quote what the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi's, where Gujarat, I believe, is his birthplace, and I also visited some of interesting places where Gandhi's was having their experience and everything. Mahatma was a champion of communal harmony and wanted all Indians, be of any religion, to unite against the colonial government. Gandhiji saw an inviolable harmony existing in all creation, enshrined in all religions, and it was this principle that led him to accord equal respect to all faiths. He stressed upon universal peace, brotherhood, and reverence for all life. This is, I think, reflected to Prime Minister Modi, one earth, one family, one future, that G20 this year in India have the theme on it, which is very relevant to what is the topic of today's discussion, which is about carbon market. And I would like to basically share what the experience and what the Indonesia has prepared, and what other countries also, such as China, has also experienced and can assist us to see and foresee the future of carbon markets. I have a little bit of a presentation. Maybe you can share that also to the audience. I will not go through everything in detail, but I think what I can explain first of all in the first slide, that Indonesia basically have a potential of 120 million hectares of forest, nature-based forest and other land use resources. 61 million hectares is in the form of protected forests, and about 59 million hectares in the form of productive forests. We do have a roadmap prepared by the Indonesian Stock Exchange that hopefully by mid-year this year, they will launch the Indonesian Carbon Exchange. And what we can see of what the roadmap is telling us, maybe next slide, please, is we do have sectors that enhance the NDC scope of where the forestry and other land use takes about 25% of all the NDC that will be required. Next slide, please. And this is the overall view of what the Indonesian future carbon exchange will be prepared in mid-year. Next, please. I think what the carbon exchange value proposition, as everyone knows, it gives you more transparency, liquidity, and efficiency. So I think everyone knows, even though we can do trading bilaterally, direct trading, also Indonesian government has prepared and assigned Indonesian Stock Exchange to do that for the exchange of carbon. Next, please. The facilitating of subsectoral trading, as it mentioned, the first announcement that already being released a week ago is through the Indonesian Energy and Mineral Resources Ministry for the, I think, the early stage of the trading using utilizing the resources from the power plants that already being put as the pilot projects for that. And for other cross-sectoral tradings, I think we could also see following that is the nature base that also have been prepared. I proudly announce also, beside being a chairman of the Indonesian Carbon Trade Association, I'm also a project owner and project developer of three nature-based solution projects, one of which in West Kalimantan, 18,000 hectares mangrove of blue carbon, will be one of the four first pilot projects that soon be announced in mid-year to be traded in this Indonesian carbon exchange. Next, please. This is just go through the more technical what will be carbon units that will be traded. There are allowance market and also offset markets, just like Director General mentioned regarding the potential of Indonesian carbon markets that will soon be executed. Next, please. And all the futures, I think, for the carbon exchange itself, from auction, regular trading, negotiation, trading, and marketplace, will also be in place. And I think this is going to be a good opportunity, especially for G20 members that can support this initiative. As we all know, Indonesia, I think right now, considered to be the second largest tropical rainforest resource after Brazil. If it's combined with Congo, I think we are the third. And also, I would like also to share that in November last year, during the G20 meeting, Indonesia has signed a trilateral agreement with Congo and Brazil for nature-based resources. Hopefully, the three powerhouse can contribute significantly to the climate change. Next. The product futures, like I have mentioned earlier, I think this is just an illustration of how the allowances and the offsets credits can be traded, and the futures are there in the Indonesian exchange that's soon to be executed. Next, please. This is the tentative indication of timeline. So basically, second half of 2023, all the executed carbon trading through the exchange will happen. Next, please. So what then are the concerns and what are the actually the facts that has been going on in the market today? I think for some of you that already involved in carbon tradings, knowing the potential of Indonesia, Indonesia right now, the government has somewhat tried to consolidate their regulations. some of the projects that has been already ongoing also being suspended for temporary period. This is basically to show the world that the seriousness of Indonesia want to have a good, solid, and more trustworthy and high integrity projects. So there are some cases around the world that there are some, I would not say fraud, but there are changes within the trading part and how the projects unable to deliver carbon credits after a certain period of years, which is breaching the contracts and agreements and the ERPA of the trading itself. So what the concern on the Indonesian regulations basically now has somewhat been resolved. There are the presidential and ministerial decrees on carbon economic values have officially been issued already, and it gives much more secure property rights. It gives much more secure foreign investment friendly, freely tradable credits, and of course, it's complied to the Article 6. And I think one of the interesting part of the decree and the regulation is Indonesia has launched and required all carbon credits that coming out of Indonesia has to be registered in our national registry system called SRN, System Registry Nasional, and also using the Indonesian credit certification of emission reduction standard. This is basically in compliance and basically our UNFCCC criteria. So we do all the validation with third-party validators, similar and the same as what the international standards require. And I proudly also can share that we have engaged with many Indian VVBs, verification and validation bodies, and I think more and more Indian VVBs are very useful to the market. I think some of which are domiciled here in Mumbai. So I think I really supported, and I'm really looking forward to working together with Indian VVBs so we can make all this carbon trading be much more high integrity, and in terms of trustworthiness, so we can achieve that all together. And if we talk on the right side about the international standard bottlenecks fact, it has been quite a challenge that international standards have encountered difficulties in getting projects certified and issuance. It takes more than 2 years for certain international standards to achieve that. And that's a big problem for us. And I've really felt that being as a project owners and project developers to have that kind of situation. In related to that, of course, consultants fees then becoming more expensive. So I think then there are more challenges that disrupting the existing standards. I believe there are many startups, digital MRVs, and digital innovation that comes from India also challenges all these standards. And I think this technology-based disruption solution would be much be a good thing to see and foresee for the future. On the other side of the Indonesian regulations, we are seeing and mandated by law that all the process for Indonesian credits to be issued and certified is maximum 4 months. So that is, I think, the comparison if you go by the Indonesian registry to the international market standards, which is having a very difficult and challenging situation for the time, for the meeting the timeline purposes. Next, please. So this is also one of the solutive alternative. It is being experienced by our colleagues from China through what they experience selling credits registered with WRI. I will not go through in detail, but if you go to the next slide, there is also next slide, please. But there is also scheme, we call it CNT model, that using not using WRI. So in this initiative, I think we have a solution for that. Next, please. So what should be done next? And I think I'm about to finish my presentation. We need harmonization of procedures. We need harmonization of standards. And of course, international standards. In the future, I think there will be many more registry systems. Probably India will have their own registry itself, but I think international standards should focus on what they do best, which is doing the standards itself, not the registry. But I think we need that harmony, as Mahatma Gandhi's teachings. We all one family, one earth, and one future. I think this is concludes everything what I can say in this keynote. Apologize for a bit long for explaining this. I can say thank you for attending this meeting, and have a wonderful side events in Mumbai. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swarga, for your detailed insights. Up next, we'd now like to begin the first session for the day on designing an effective carbon market for India. To begin with, I'd like to invite Ms. Ashwini Hingne, Senior Manager in the Climate Program at WRI-India, to present some of the recommendations and learnings from our work on carbon markets over the last few years. Ashwini, on to you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning once again, and thanks, Shubhangi. So thank you all for joining us here in person, and also to those who are joining online. And with the opening remarks provided by the speakers ahead of me, and as we move deeper into exploring some of these aspects of what a successful carbon market in India could look like, it is my pleasure to share with you all some of the research that the team at WRI has been doing in this space that has tried to answer to some extent some of the questions that have already been raised and that still need to be answered. Some of these questions include: what is the potential of a carbon market for India? How can it be designed so that it can actually lead to reductions that are cost efficient? And how can we grow while decoupling our emissions from growth? And in terms of practical measures, what will it take to implement a successful carbon market in India that does not impact the competitiveness of the Indian industry? How can Indian industry actually prepare themselves for upcoming regulations, not just in India, but also globally? And we did this by designing and implementing a simulation of a carbon market for the first time ever with 21 large Indian companies. So to begin with, let's recap. What is the potential, or what is the purpose of a carbon market in India? And here, some of these points have been touched upon, which is India already has announced its targets to reduce the emission intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030. It has also announced that it will reduce a total 1 billion tons of CO2 from now until 2030. So the carbon market can be an important tool to help us achieve these goals. The second is as an economic instrument, it can help do this at a lower cost. And finally, it is an instrument that can help incentivize the economy entirely to reduce its emissions. And through our research, what we found was that purely by aligning a carbon market with an ambition that is just at the average level of the current voluntary commitments from Indian businesses, we can actually achieve up to 5.6% of emission intensity reduction by the year 2030 compared to what existing policies can help us achieve. The industry sector, which also includes the emissions from power sector, total comprises approximately 65.7% of India's total GHG emissions based on the most latest data. A carbon market that actually covers the industry sector can help target emissions beyond just the energy use emissions that are currently regulated to also include process emissions. And therefore, the reductions that it can bring about are to the tune of 1.3 billion from now until 2030. Second, we also found that as an economic instrument, during our simulation itself, the costs of meeting the targets that were set were reduced by almost 28%. And this was purely due to the option of trading, where companies could meet their targets at costs that were lower than what they would have, than what it would have costed for them to reduce internally. And finally, if it is designed as such, a carbon market can actually help India mobilize finance and drive emission reductions not only from emission-intensive sectors, but also from other sectors that are relatively harder to regulate, which includes sectors like MSMEs, which do contribute significantly to India's growth, employment, as well as emissions, but are much harder to regulate and quite diverse. So let's look at how we arrived at this. So in a nutshell, this is what our study looked like. And we wanted to basically, through our research, support the development of an effective carbon markets that can drive real emission reductions, that is cost effective, that can encourage deeper decarbonization and also early action. And finally, that is rooted in sound economic theory, but also locally relevant. To achieve this, we looked at a combination of primary and secondary research, where we drew from economic principles of how a carbon market could be designed to be successful, and also looking at more than 15 years of global experience in carbon markets across different regions. And that, along with India's own experience over the past decade with the PAT and REC mechanisms, we developed a carbon market simulation in consultation with businesses across sectors in India to understand their needs, challenges, as well as the perspectives to design the market. The evidence collected from the market outcomes and participant feedback was once again contextualized, as you can see, with India's current economic, developmental, and climate priorities, as well as learnings from existing markets, to inform finally a set of robust design and policy recommendations, as well as a capacity building suggestion. So this carbon market simulation was implemented over the year of 2020-2021 and included almost 21 large Indian companies, which, as you can see, represent a variety of sectors and constitute almost 10% of India's industry sector emissions. The carbon market simulation itself included almost every step that goes into an actual carbon market. The first was baselining the emissions for these companies based on their historical data, and this was actual data from the past 3 years. Based on this data, as well as projected emissions, sectoral trajectories, as well as their existing voluntary commitments, we developed targets for these companies. And these targets were in most cases intensity-based, and then allowances were allocated based on the production in their base year. Third aspect that we included in this was to develop a simple measurement, reporting, and verification, which is MRV structure, to track emissions over the course of the entire year. And companies reported their data on a quarterly basis. These were mostly self-reported because verification could not have happened multiple times in the year. And finally, this is the data that companies were encouraged to use in order to inform the trading, which again took place on a quarterly basis, and we had 4 rounds of trading through the entire year. And to give you an example of how this trading works. So here what we see on the left axis is the price, and on the y-axis we see the price, and on the x-axis the trade volume. So for example, for companies that wanted to buy allowances, shared sealed bids during the trading window. For example, 100 allowances at a price of 500 rupees. On the other hand, companies that wanted to sell allowances shared sealed asks during the trading window. So, for example, 100 allowances at a 1200 rupees rate. And this is the asks are indicated in red and the blue indicates the bids. And what we did at the end of the trading window is to aggregate all these bids and asks to create a demand and supply curve, which intersects here at the point of 800 rupees. And all the bids and asks that were submitted that lie on the left-hand side of it, which is for any buyer that was willing to buy at a price that was lower than the clearing price, got their bids executed, and any sellers who got a price more than what they had asked for, those bids got executed. So this is in a nutshell how the trading worked, and here is a representation of how the different trading cycles actually turned out. So as you can see on the left-hand side graph, we have the number of allowances on the y-axis on the left. The different trading cycles are represented on the x-axis, and the right-hand side y-axis represents the price. So as you can see, this was a market with a very high ambition compared to what they had already been implementing, and therefore we see a very high demand, which is represented by the blue columns. On the other hand, what we also see that due to this steady demand, we also saw a rise in prices. So the first trading cycle actually saw a price of only 500 rupees, which rose steadily to about 1700. So this is from about $6 to about $20 towards the end. What we also see is the total number of bids that actually got executed, which is how well were companies able to actually trade in the market and get their bids executed. So to try to be on the left-hand side, so to get the allowances that they're looking for or to be able to sell their allowances. Here again, we saw a consistent rise in the number of allowances that got cleared. The last two bars that we see are actually the two rounds that happened in the final set of trading. So we allowed an extra round for all the clearances to happen. So we see a complete, the yellow and the gray are at the same level. So all of the asks from the sellers were executed. At the end of this notional market, we had set out a goal for ourselves to achieve almost 3.2 million tons of reduction, 2.3 million tons of reduction in emissions from a baseline of 57.9 million metric tons. What we actually ended up achieving was half of that, which was about 56.8 million metric tons that was achieved at the end of it. So despite this being simply an experiment, a notional market, a kind of a project to just see what would a carbon market in India would look like. How could companies actually trade in a carbon market? What can they expect in a real carbon market? This already gave us almost 50% of the target that we are looking for. And this is once again happening in the year 2020, 2021, where again, a lot of the plans that companies had in executing their own emission reductions were not completely implemented. So therefore, we are quite optimistic about, the fact that when a real carbon market comes with a regulatory backing, as Mr. Bakre mentioned, with real targets, I think companies with the right kind of capacity building would be able to even achieve the targets that were set out. But what does all of this mean for designing a carbon market? So first, we can look at what is it that the companies actually shared with us. So like I mentioned, after the market, we went back to companies to get their feedback on what is it after this experience that they see to be important factors in terms of design to help them participate effectively in a carbon market and for India to be able to achieve its emission reduction goals. So the first thing that companies wanted was a wider group of sectors that are covered, so not just emission intensive sectors, so that they have more options to buy and sell credits. The second is an intensity-based target setting, which is already the norm in India, and also the fact that our NDCs, so an aligned targets with NDCs that are intensity-based that also allow the industry to grow is something that was shared, and that these could be based on sectors and by creating benchmarks that reflected the realities of Indian industry sectors would be what they would look for. The third thing that companies were keen on was to actually not have price collars. So globally, we see price stability mechanisms like floor prices or ceiling prices that try to bring in certain level of stability to ensure some predictability in the price. But actually what companies shared with us was the fact that with a robust demand and with clear vision on where the market is going, they actually would not want price collars, and they would like the prices to actually reflect the real demand and supply in the market. The fourth thing that companies also mentioned was based on the experience of the simulation, and we'll hopefully also hear more from companies in the next panel, is that they would like more frequent trading that also gives them more opportunities to learn from their trading in the past, to be able to more be attuned to the market, to be able to make better decisions, and also to be able to meet their compliance along the way and not just once at the end. The final thing is, of course, again mentioned by Dr. Riza just before me, and I think also a lot of companies have been looking forward to, is to have more standardized emission factors, a more comprehensive reporting program that is harmonized to their financial years and not that does not run, is not aligned with it. So these are some of the key things that came from companies. But like I mentioned, we also combine this with what we have learned from India's own experience, from global markets and economic theory to arrive at, and I'm sharing just the top 5 important recommendations. So our report is coming out soon, and which outlines the exhaustive list of all the design recommendations based on our study. But here are the 5 key things that we believe would be important for a successful carbon market. So the first is that the market has to really drive decarbonization. And to do that, it is recommended to have ambitious and long-term targets with 3 years compliance period, so that companies have enough time to actually implement their emission reduction strategies, but at the same time have a vision on, or visibility on, where the targets are moving in the future, and therefore make investment decisions that are also more long-term. The second thing is, as I mentioned, is sectoral intensity-based targets, which can then move on to absolute targets as the market matures. And these 2 things would essentially create the right environment to create, firstly, a robust demand for the market, which is very important to ensure that there is enough credits going on, and at the same time there is a high price. And on the second hand, it also allows companies to make better decisions in the long term. The second important aspect that the carbon market needs to achieve is to have cost-efficient emission reductions, and to do that, we recommend a wider set of sectors that are covered. These could not necessarily have been mandated. So currently, what we already have seen in the plans is having energy-intensive sectors that are already identified to have a mandatory target, but the market itself can be opened up for others to be able to participate in it. And that basically brings about cost optimization, as we saw in the simulation as well. But it clearly also allows for the time from now until for some newer low carbon technologies to become financially feasible. So in the interim, it allows for the lower cost emissions to actually be utilized and to be actually be implemented. The second thing is, like I mentioned, sectors like MSMEs, which have a lot of potential of emission reduction, which have a need for more efficiency in their operations, can also be incentivized to reduce their emissions by creating a mechanism where companies that are mandated for under these carbon market have a limited option of being able to buy offsets. So it also creates that opportunity for MSMEs to be able to utilize that finance. The third important thing that the carbon market should be able to do is to sustain our economic growth and to also be able to decarbonize at the same time. And to do this, one of the ways that other carbon markets have used globally is to be able to identify sectors that might be vulnerable. So for example, sectors that might be exporting in global markets might find themselves being less competitive due to a carbon price in India. So in such cases, there could be financial incentives towards lowering the cost of actually implementing their low carbon technologies. So this could be in the form of tax rebates, it could be in the form of lower cost of capital. And finally, all of this then helps reduce the competitiveness concerns and also encourages early uptake of emission reduction technologies that are currently more expensive. The fourth important thing, which again was emphasized by Mr. Pandit, was to ensure that this is a credible market, that the carbon market in India also is able to actually link to global markets, that it has the kind of value that it can derive and mobilize international finance. And for this, an important key step is to ensure that we have a robust monitoring, reporting, and verification protocol that is also simple and standardized and aligned with our current reporting structures and is consistent over a period of time. And finally, of course, also aligned with the best practices globally. And finally, as we have seen in the past, compliance is an important factor. No company wants to fail voluntarily, but at the same time, with the right kind of policies and the enabling environment, the carbon market needs to function in a way that it encourages companies to be able to meet their targets. And this could be by doing a couple of things. One is to have interim targets, which is not just to demonstrate the meeting of targets at the end of the compliance period, but also to have interim targets. This helps, once again, early action, but also helps companies course correct over a period of time. The other measures are relatively more straightforward, but which could be either incentives or penalties, which could be, again, monetary or non-monetary. But the important thing here is to also make sure that at the end of it, there is still a requirement to meet the target. So it's not just about being able to pay the penalty and, just be done with it, but rather both meet the targets as well as the penalties and incentives. So these are a few recommendations, but one of the key things that we also wanted to talk about today, and this is my last slide, I know we are already running behind time, but is to have a very, very solid and ongoing capacity building program for Indian industry. So on the one hand, we have tried to categorize Indian industry into different levels of capacity. So on the one hand, there are industries or companies that are probably representative of the kind of companies that already participated in the simulation, that have their own accounting and reporting in place, that have a GHG management plan, that also probably have experience in existing carbon markets or in PAT and REC. What they would require essentially is support in being able to participate more effectively on how can they trade more effectively, how can they make decisions based on their own internal costs of reductions and make sure that they minimize their risks. They could also benefit from experience in trading through simulations and trading interfaces with trading methods. And on the other hand of the spectrum, we have companies who currently probably have no capacity or understanding of their own GHG emissions. So for them, it would be important to build their capacity to be able to collect the data that is required to be able to inventorize their GHGs, to estimate their emissions, and also come up with, to be able to identify reduction potential within their operations. And again, within this spectrum, we see that, perhaps companies in the categories A and B are already mandated by some law or regulation, and capacity building would help them achieve their targets and at the same time be able to do so in a more effective manner. On the other hand, as we look at a broader carbon market or opportunities under the offsets program, companies in categories C and D could actually equip themselves to be able to make use of this opportunity to finance their decarbonization efforts and to, in the process, build their own capacities to, over a period of time, decarbonize. So this is on the capacity building program, and we'll be happy to share more details on this. But just two other quick things I wanted to mention was the fact that we have our executive summary out, which is available here for you to look through. Our entire report is coming soon. The QR code here will also allow you to download the executive summary. And myself, Varun, and Shubhangi are present here for any questions you all might have on the research that has been done. Thank you so much, and over to you, Shubhangi.
Thank you very much, Ashwini. Next, I would like to invite some of our esteemed panelists who are experts from the industry and policy-making space and have spent many years thinking about these issues. Over the next 1 hour, they'll share some of their insights on what it will take to establish a carbon market in India that leads to credible, sustainable, and cost-efficient emission reductions. So joining us today are Dr. Arvind Bodhankar, Executive Director and Chief Risk Officer of Dalmia Bharat Group, He couldn't join us in person today, but he's present online. We have Mr. Kaushik Chatterjee, Executive Director and Chief Financial Officer and member of the board of Tata Steel Group. We have Ms. Tejashree Joshi, General Manager and Head of Environmental Engineering Services at Godrej & Boyce. We have Ms. Diksha Vats, Chief Sustainability Officer at the Aditya Birla Group. Mr. Bose Verghese, Senior Director of ESG at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Dr. Carsten Neuhoff, Professor at the Technical University of Berlin and Head of Department at DIW Berlin, who's also joined us online. And Mr. Varad Pandey, Partner of Impact, Sustainability and New Initiatives at Omidyar Network India. Over to you, Ulka. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a very nice panel. Two are online, and Kaushik, please do join us. We're a little bit behind schedule, about 15-20 minutes behind schedule, but the plan is to keep some time for discussion, some questions, comments from the audience as well. So I thought what we'll try to do is to have 2 rounds going around this panel, including the online members. In the first round, what I would request all of you to do is give your comments on the sort of the nitty-gritties of the design, right? So there are 3 issues over here as far as design is concerned. One is about the targets. Any carbon market is only as good as its targets. So how do you think in the Indian carbon market targets should be designed, should be set, or should be allocated? And how do you think corporate and national targets can be aligned? The second question, and you don't have to answer all of them, you can pick your favorites, right? The second question is about compliance. As you can see from our study, even in this little study with very committed people, there wasn't full compliance. So how do you think compliance rates, and we know that, whatever markets we've had in India, there have been issues of oversupply, there have been issues of poor compliance. So how, in your mind, do you think compliance can be ensured? And the third issue is that of competitiveness. That is, what complementary policies do we need, maybe outside of the market design, which will ensure that the competitiveness of trade expo sectors can be safeguarded. And I know Carsten has already booked this question for himself to address in the first round. But yeah, I think over here have a lot of experience of companies who have for many years had internal carbon pricing. Some of them have participated in our carbon market simulation, and some of them are actually aware of, like Varad, the Gujarat experiment, Carsten, China and EU. So I think we have a lot of experience, and we can delve right in to these detailed issues. So let me use my chair's prerogative and say we'll start with the physical people first, and then Dr. Arvind Bodankar, if you don't mind, we'll come to you and Carsten. Yeah? Usually I'm on the online side of things, so I'm always I don't like penalizing the online participants, but this time we'll do it this way, and then maybe in the second round we'll change the order and go to the online people first. So Kaushik, maybe we can start with you. Pick any one or more of the questions about targets, compliance, or competitiveness. Thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and good afternoon to everybody. See, given my exposure and experience in the EU ETS through our business in Europe, which has evolved over the last 15 years. The first one is to have a very definitive pathway in this whole process, because just not trading for trading's sake, or not just pricing for pricing's sake. There is a time that where we are currently, there has to be a more definitiveness. So India has its 2070 goals, so obviously it has to align with the 2070 goals. Anything ahead or less than that will have its own disruptions. So clearly the way we need to work is to ensure that the markets are given time to mature. And that's where the participation is the maximum. Then there is a verification process. Then there is the way in which your compliance is kind of looked at, and for which there has to be an oversight. So these are, to me, the 4 things that works. And I'm purely saying it from what I've seen in Europe mostly, and now for the last couple of years also in UK after the Brexit. And I think the way to bring about people is not starting with targets, but onboarding as many participants and emitters that you have. So there is a total quantification of emission that happens in India. There is a pathway that we have to go towards 2070. There would be sectoral pathways within that, and then how do you set that process? So the way it happened in EU, for example, was to give, based on sectors and production capacities and emission norms, there were allowances given, which were free allowances. It was called free allowances. And over time, it tapered down towards a zero allowance at a point in time. And if that is the way India has to move, maybe we don't have so much time as 15 years. We'll have to crash it a bit, but we will obviously have to start by first understanding the sectoral level NDCs. And that sector level NDCs then gets linked to these allowances and a pathway. You can take a decade, you can take half a decade, depends on what is the level of preparedness and technologies available to tighten. For sectors like hard to abate sectors like steel, if I can talk about, the technology is not there as yet from a net zero perspective, but technologies are emerging, investments are happening, and it will move towards that. So, and these are 20, 25-year-old assets which you are investing. So there is a capital allocation decision that comes in along with it. But fundamentally, once the allowances are given, the verification is very important, and there must be standards for verification, and then gets into the compliance, because once you comply, then verify and then comply, it works. And the penalties are pretty significant in mature geographies. So you have €100 per ton penalty, which then forces companies to ensure that they need to do the right thing. And if not, you will be out of business, because the carbon cost will also become higher and higher over time. So the pricing for the carbon is for the market to set, because there will be companies or organizations which will have surplus to sell, and there will be ones which will be buying it. So that equilibrium is best set by the market. The more liquid it is, the more stable it is. For example, the EU prices used to be hovering around 15, 18 euros for many years. Last 4 years, it's jumped up to somewhere around 85, 86, because the free allowances are tapering down. So the supply of free allowances coming down, the demand is increasing, and therefore I think IEA has projected more than 100, 120, but it's already reaching the same level. IEA talked about in 2030. It's happening in 2023, 24. So I think that's how I would look at the whole process, and good oversight body which ensures stability of markets, which ensures assurance of a verification process and good compliance.
Thanks very much. Tejaswi.
Thank you. I think Mr. Chatterjee has almost summarized, our thought process. But today, if you see the Indian corporate scenario, I think many sectors have not even been in the regulatory regime. I mean, if you look at the PAT regime we had, very few sectors actually know what it is in terms of, intensity reduction and the whole trading bit. There are many sectors who are left out of it, have no idea about a carbon market. Forget about a market, they don't even have an idea of a regulatory regime for capping carbon emissions. Although there are many companies in these sectors who have taken voluntary initiatives in terms of moving on decarbonization pathway, it's left to what could happen and what has been happening, and which is palatable to the business without a fear of having a kind of imposed penalty or any regulatory requirements which is requiring those sectors. And there are many sectors which are having significant impact on the overall carbon pie in the whole footprint, which are left out. And to name a few, is like a construction sector, which is highly unregulated, although it has impact on both sides, on the development side as well as the operational side. I think the first thing probably we need to do is to bring in more players in the whole game, for market-based mechanism for carbon regulation, because they will take time to get sensitized to the whole ask of carbon markets and regulatory requirements. Like the large hard-to-abate sectors have had cycles of PAT and have matured over the time in terms of really knowing what is the demand and supply and so on and so forth. Like I said, there are many players who are totally blank about this. Although there are large corporate groups having diverse set of activities, putting that together into one understanding of what is the obligation on carbon reduction itself is a black spot today. So what is required is basically to bring in more players, in short. Of course, they will need time to understand these aspects. They will need time to understand where are the other sectors who have already progressed on this, who have fair bit of idea in terms of how this market would probably move once it moves away from a regulatory regime to a more voluntary based carbon regime. But not there, being there, it's a little bit of a disadvantage if they were to directly enter into a carbon market. So that is the first step, I think. And obviously, when we talk about decarbonization, the best approach is the hierarchical approach in terms of mitigating the carbon emissions in the first place by technological interventions up to the extent which is acceptable to the business as a cost. Then moving ahead on decarbonizing the use of energy or the type of energy which is a mix of energy use, and then looking at the offsets like we normally say in the net zero journey. What is also essential is to develop guidelines in terms of the supply side of carbon, the credits which would be there in the market, especially from small providers who are going to create those credits. In terms of suppliers who would have nature-based solutions, today not even aware about or anywhere near the whole carbon market game. It may be they may be indirectly involved through the hard-to-abate sectors, but themselves not having an exposure to this, not knowing the benefit they would have with the carbon market in place, and in turn fund these kind of projects more and more in the country, which aligns to the indices in terms of not only decarbonization but many other indices in terms of bringing in more conservation efforts, in terms of bringing in more nature-based abatement efforts. So while taking thought ahead from what Mr. Chatterjee said, I think these are a few areas where we can start prioritizing in terms of bringing in this regime and bringing in more players from both the sides of demand and supply to have a robust mix where where a balancing out of the market can happen, and that will really bring down the cost or the prices that we are talking about for mitigation.
Thanks.
No, thank you. Thanks, Ulka, and thank you for having me here. So I would just build on it. You spoke about three things, which is targets, compliance, and competitiveness. And I think they all go hand in hand. Like, for an industry to be competitive, targets need to be in keeping with how overall sector moves, because with the way global markets have been, whether it's steel coming out of Asia or coming out of Europe, so therefore competitiveness at what levels? Are we talking about at regional levels or at global levels? So that's important. And if I was to just stay with targets, I guess targets have to be in keeping with what are we trying to achieve, and building on the whole concept of a mitigation hierarchy. So, and Mr. Bakri talked about it in the morning, there are a lot of low-hanging fruits in terms of how you start that. Are you efficient enough in terms of use of your energy? So a lot of it has been addressed. Some of it still needs to be done, which links to the marginal cost of abatement of carbon. So, some of those energy efficiency measures which had a payback period of, say, 18 months, so a marginal cost of abatement of, say, about $6 to $8, done. Maybe those were the ones that got included in a PAT kind of scheme. But how do you move up? In each of those, move up or go deeper. So if it is energy efficiency, and then it would be a fuel switch, and then it would be a change in technology, and last you go to something like an offset. So how do you go deeper into each of those, and how do you move up therefore on technology maturity and marginal cost of abatement? And to be able to do that, how do you get access to pools of capital? Because all of that need to be considered. Otherwise, it just remains a wish, and it would just go. It wouldn't really make a substantive change on ground. All of this needs to be thought through and stitched in for it to make an actual impact in terms of reducing the carbon emissions per se. And to be able to do some of these, so those are actions, and then of course enablers to say, how do you assess the quality of what is being talked about? Therefore, robust MRV mechanisms, therefore robust resources of people who would go about doing it, people in agencies who would do it, and linking it to who uses them. So linking the buyer and generator of those carbon credits. And last point here I would like to talk about is also to look at it from, a lot of conversation now is moving to, for example, cement is what cement does. So how do you link the conversation from production end to use end? So do we therefore pick up to begin with, say, the whole built environment space or the mobility space? So how many of these things come together to make and then to use, because the emissions that are getting generated get generated by many of these things coming together. So that would be my last thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, congratulations to you and to CII for this excellent piece of work. So I don't work with big industry or big business. I've been following this space very closely from two vantage points. One is I work for an investment fund focused on social impact, and we invest in early stage entrepreneurs who are creating impact. And one of the points I wanted to mention was that I think the carbon markets are not just an opportunity for big business. They're a massive opportunity for our startups. We are seeing a number of startups both in the arena of better measurement of emissions, but also who are trying to think of sectors like agriculture and thinking about how they can harness the carbon markets to create greater value and income for farmers. So, changing agricultural practices from conventional to regenerative has a mitigation benefit. And if that can be monetized in the carbon market, it can be huge for countries like ours. Similarly, we are coming across people who are trying to think of livelihood plays like improved cook stoves or cleaner drinking water. That means that you don't have to boil water, and there's a mitigation potential there. And can that be leveraged and monetized in the carbon market? So I think one broader point I wanted to make from my vantage point was this is not just an opportunity for obviously India's big NDCs and for our big businesses, a massive opportunity also for our startups and from a livelihood perspective for a large number of people in India. The second angle I'm very interested in this topic is, I used to work in the Ministry of Environment and Forest many years ago, and one of the experiments we started was something called an emissions trading scheme. And Urmi, you are in the room, I think you would remember this from back in the days. But really thinking about an environmental market for PM 2.5, which is the dominant ambient air pollutant in India. And so we got interest from the government of Gujarat and the Gujarat Pollution Control Board, and a number of global researchers, including JPAL, the Energy Policy Institute of Chicago at University of Chicago, etc., and said that there are many industrial clusters where we want to reduce PM 2.5. Our traditional approach has been to say we'll set caps and everybody has to adhere to the caps. Can we think of a market-based mechanism? And Surat was picked as a pilot project. And over the last, it took a lot of while to sort of put it all together. But the bottom line is that, and now there are rigorous randomized control trial results of what has been achieved there. There's been a 23% reduction in the emissions in Surat with zero incremental cost to industry or to government. So I'm giving that as an example of the power of what this thing can achieve, although that's an ambient air, not carbon trading. But I think it's the power of what this thing can achieve if done well. And the other point being that we can learn a lot from India's own examples. We have the PAT example, which was talked about earlier. We have the emissions trading scheme example that I mentioned, which is actually very well documented. Happy to share the detailed results of this with you, with anybody who might be interested. But I took away 4 lessons from that, Ulka. And this will resonate with many of the points which have already been made, but I like to think about it in terms of the 4 C's of getting this right. The first C, I would say, is just credibility, and especially credibility of the measurement process. What was done in the Gujarat model, for example, was before they even, as part of the baselining, they introduced a new technology called the Continuous Emissions Monitoring System, CEMS. And CEMS was implemented in all the units that were part of the market because it was very important to get a consistent and a reliable source of truth on what is being measured. And of course, I think India has done a tremendous work over the last decade on things like setting up digital public infrastructure, a term that you would have heard a lot of in the context of G20 as well, whether it's UPI, whether it's the National Data Analytics Platform, and so on. I think there are important learnings India can take on how to build at scale, build fast, and create something of value on the measurement front. So that's the first C, credibility. I think the second is coherence, which is to say that in a single market, it's important to have very comparable and consistent organizations. And I think, therefore, I know that one of the suggestions made earlier was to have greater sector coverage, but at the same time, it's also important to have comparability in place. I think Pat did a very good job of this. The reason they started with certain designated consumers was that at least there's comparability, capacity, etc. of measurement in those groups, and they did not go for sectors like agricultural pumps or whatever else, right? And I think in the similar way, in the Gujarat experience, focused only on those that had the SEM system installed. So I think coherence and then go for breadth. First start with coherence, then go for breadth with the second C. The third would be consensus, and I think this simulation is a great example of consensus. But I think just to say that taking everybody along like you guys are doing is very important. And lastly, I'll say on capacity, and I think this is something I'm sure we'll go into a little bit more, but really having a world-class regulator that is professional, digitally born, and is globally connected to the global markets, I think will be important. So just I think those 4 C's is how I sort of summarize the takeaways: credibility, coherence, consensus, and capacity.
Thank you. So I'm going to take up the target setting first. See, carbon market is just a tool, right, to reduce cut emissions, and it doesn't have to include everything. The entire nation's emissions don't have to be under a carbon market. Now, if you look at the EU ETS example, in the entire EU bloc, through the ETS, they are only targeting 40% of the emissions, 40%, and 10,000 facilities. Now, when you look at your high-emitting sectors, and you look at sectors that give you the scale to move the needle, I think that's the way you would look at it. It could be 40% for us, it could be 50%. And there may be sectors where the players are numerous and really small. And it'll be really difficult for a carbon market to manage compliance model, like the EU ETS. So I think that which sector, what would be the quantum of national emission that we would bring under a carbon market will depend on these considerations. Number two, Kaushik has already mentioned, it has to be aligned to our net zero 2070. And while we give the ball and the rules to play, we should show the goalpost also. You know, you are not going to get off this game anytime soon. We are going all the way to 2070 net zero. So these two, I think, will give some clarity in setting the target. Now, of course, there will be challenges, finding benchmarks and things like that, accommodating for scale. The other big issue that we are going to see in that process, as a country, if you look at EU ETS, they have allocations set aside for new capacities and capacity expansions. And in a country like India, we are going to have a lot of that. In the next 30, 40 years, what we are going to have in terms of new facilities and capacities, probably going to be much more than what we already have. We are nowhere close to peaking the emissions. So when we look at the quantum of national emissions and trying to get on a net zero trajectory, we'll realize that for the sector selected, it's not going to be easy to, because these new facilities, new capacity will keep coming. But I think these considerations will have to go into the target setting. And therefore, it's not going to be as easy as it is what EU ETS has done. The second part, I'm going to bring competitiveness to this. Now, if you look at what is happening across the world, specifically CBAM, the EU CBAM is a carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is going to launch in October, which I'm pretty sure everybody's aware of. That is clearly if you are going to be affected by that, your competitiveness is going to be based on your capacity to reduce your emissions. And I think looking ahead, that is the way the world is going to move. So this program, the carbon market, while it should give these sectors opportunity to move along with the market, and it should also look ahead of the market. And I just recently read, that ArcelorMittal, it's a big headline. ArcelorMittal goes for electric arc furnace in Europe and blast furnace elsewhere. Going with the market and going ahead of the market. And then compliance. To me, 3, 4 elements. One, under the EU ETS, everything is built into regulations. It's a legal compliance. If you look at their documentation, there are so many regulations under EU ETS. And the emission reduction plan is part of your consent to operate. It's very fundamental to your existence. And then they have a very strong penal mechanism. For missing the target, 100 euros, an allowance equivalent. That is the penalty. By paying the penalty, you are not off the hook. You still have to get that allowance and put it back. So very serious compliance mechanism is in place. Then the market being able to balance the supply and demand and designing the market and setting the target. And that is key to compliance.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's now move to Arvind and then Karsten. Arvind, you have 4 or 5 minutes.
Hi,
please.
thank you, Ulka. Thank you, WRI. Thank you, CII, for giving me this opportunity. And my apologies for not being there physically present. I have 4 or 5 points which most of the speakers have already covered. And while target setting, one thing is that we should not compromise with the competitiveness of the industry, because most of the industries now will start exporting and they will have to compete with the other player. Now, definitely when we want to have technology or reduce the CO2 emission, it is going to cost us. So we should be competitive as far as the pricing is concerned when we export. Second one is definitely the target should be sector specific. Like I come from cement industry, and you can't have a target at par for cement industry and the other industry where it is easier to abate the CO2 emission. Cement is perhaps the hardest to abate, and process related emissions, 60% of the emissions are related to processes, and as long as you find a replacement for calcium carbonate, you are not going to produce the cement. And cement is an essential component for growth of the country. And when we are targeting for a 5 trillion economy, cement is going to be an essential. Same applies to steel also. So one size doesn't fit for all. So you need to have sector specific targets. Thirdly, you must look at the capacity and capability of the industry, because different industries are at different level. And I would appreciate the PAT scheme at that point of time. They did consider those kind of things, looking at the capacity, the technology, what each of the DCs were having. So that needs to be considered while setting up a target. One important point is availability of the policy, especially RTC power. And when we are talking about round the clock power, today also still, while a lot of work has happened and we have been advocating for that, but still on the power banking, or especially on the contract demand, how much of renewable you can have, there is a work to happen in that area. So annualized power banking or something like that, these kind of policies would be essential when we set the target. And of course, as Kaushik and the other speaker mentioned, the targets has to be aligned to the 2070 roadmap which India has set. Anything if we want to do before that, definitely it will add up to the cost. While as a cement industry and my particular company, we have set a target for 2040, even carbon negative. But definitely that is going to cost us, and cement industry cannot pass it on to the consumers. If you look at the price hike which cement industry has made in last 1 decade, it's not more than 1 to 3%. The bag which we used to sell at 380 rupees is today being sold at 380 to 400 only. So there is no price hike. Now, anything what we are going to set up a target, let's say by science-based target, and we did the calculation. So if we have to reduce our footprint by 3%, it's going to add up the cost by 3 to 5%. So that thing needs to be kept in the mind, that we cannot pass on any burden to the consumers, because cement goes for poor people. 60 to 65% of the cement goes for rural housing, and especially the government's scheme on Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. Any increase in the prices of cement is going to impact. And also, finally, you must ensure that what is the contribution of the sector to the GDP. Now, if sector is contributing to the GDP, and if their EBITDA is going down because of the carbon pricing or this thing, so that may not be a good thing for the economy. So these are the 4 or 5 points I would like to mention when we do the target setting for the industry.
Great, thank you so much. Karsten, we'll come to you, and we'll also reverse the order a little bit so that you could also take the next question as well about experiences from EU and China. But first, we'd love to hear from you, especially about the competitiveness issue that you're keen on addressing.
Thanks so much. I'm really sorry that I couldn't come back, as I've been in January and Delhi already. It's a bit far. But really impressive study you're bringing forward. And I'd like to pick up a bit on the point that Mr. Chatterjee brought up in terms of starting from the NDC perspective and then building up the overall perspective. Because this has been effectively the big debate in Europe since 2005. Do we have an emissions trading system as the main instrument, or do we also have sectoral policies and instruments with it? And I think this debate in a way has hindered a lot of progress for a long period with it. I think there are strong cases to say just emissions trading across all sectors. We don't need to go into detail as a policymaker of a sector. There are economic efficiency arguments you can bring forward with it, but we've seen that it doesn't deliver. It certainly doesn't deliver the deep developments or the modernization that we are looking for. And that's why I think for the 2030 governance, now we have more this targets at the sector level and thinking far more clearly of what are the transitions that we need at the sector level. We can't shift to high shares of renewables if you don't have the grids, if you don't have the flexibility in the system, if you don't have the financial arrangements complementing it. And so that's where sector targets for renewables and the dedicated instruments have become quite a crucial element. The same for energy efficiency. It's product standards that have had the biggest impact on energy efficiency improvements by now in Europe. And energy efficiency targets to underpin then what we do in the transport sector in terms of standards are important. And it's interestingly, the Confederation of German Industry now argues for thermal retrofit strategies in the building sector, so that buildings programs are implemented to save energy in the building sector, because we have scarcity not only in the short term but also in the long term of energy. And so again here, there are sector-specific policy instruments in place. And finally, if you look at industry, also there we now have sector-specific targets in terms of thinking of clean steel production and having dedicated instruments to support with carbon contracts for differences, the investments in hydrogen-based steel making, for example. So they are about to be tenders later this year for this kind of products. So that is not to say we don't have a carbon market, but it's to say it's complementing the sector-specific NDCs and instruments in a way that the overall cap gives an overall level of ambition, gives an overall sense that we have to deliver at the sector level, and if we don't, then it gets expensive. If we deliver, then we modernize our industry. It is an instrument that is helpful to kind of get prices right in order to then allow the incentives to work within the sectors as well. So I think this complementarity is something we are still exploring now with, but I'm more happy now than I was for the last 15 years in terms of how we see that as complementary, the supporting each other rather than as competing with each other, which was for a long time the sense where policymakers in Europe had the interest of their instrument, the carbon market, or their instrument, the renewable support mechanism. And now we start to put them a bit closer together. And I think that was something in the report which I really appreciated a lot. I was wondering how to kind of strengthen this complementarity element and think how to bring this more forward. You asked then in terms of the competitiveness and the international experience with it. My sense, having done studies on the competitiveness since 2005, is that at the end, we always get new policymakers, new advocates coming in and saying, hey, we can do something, we can phase out free allocation and we can run the system. And at the end, we always ended up with free allocation. And with a free allocation for industry, we largely undermined the effectiveness of the carbon pricing system for the industry. The uncertainty about future free allocation, the political focus on the scale of free allocation ultimately determined that the ETS price was not very helpful for big strategic investments, long-term investments on companies and the setting around it. And so I gave up 4 years or 5 years ago of kind of lobbying or supporting analysis to kind of think how to phase out free allocation by itself. I don't think it is possible to do it, to phase it out if there's not another clear response to address carbon leakage and competitive concerns. It's not effective having an ETS system with a system in place. If you look at China, they have free allocation or even exclude at the moment industry for this reason. So two options, just for the further discussion. One is obviously with the CBAM approach, which has a lot of limitations, particularly looking at exports, looking at the value chain. Second is carbon pricing global alliance, which is difficult. Third one, which I feel would also be attractive in the Indian context, is to complement something like the PET system, the upstream system, with a levy on basic materials per ton of steel, per ton of cement clinker, which then gives the revenue stream to fund higher cost clean production and encourages the construction sector to also have the incentives and recycling to go along with it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. May I also ask you maybe to address one more, maybe just give, if I asked you to share 2 or 3 key design points, 2 or 3 key learnings from the Chinese system, which you've also studied, or again, the EU ETS, which of course we have a much more experience of it. But for the new upcoming Indian carbon market, if Karsten, you could give 2 or 3 of your key takeaways or recommendations, that would be great. Thank you. Could be on any aspect, not just competitiveness, just broadly.
Yeah. So I think in the Chinese system, we see this free allocation to the power sector now, which with dedicated benchmarks to different technologies and an updating to it. So at the end, I'm not really sure what this will deliver. And I think it is at the end, it's similar to what the PET scheme is doing in the Indian power system. So it doesn't really add much to it because with the dynamic allocation coming from it. What some of the regional pilots had earlier on, and I think you mentioned in your report, was the idea of then to re-establish the carbon price on the electricity by encouraging or requiring electricity users to pay a carbon cost corresponding to the carbon intensity of the electricity production. I think China has a big challenge that they don't have a liberalized power market, so the dispatch is anyway operated in a somewhat different approach in many of the provinces in China, which makes them the carbon price less effective if it would even be there in place. So for me, really the question there is, what is the objective of implementing the mechanism? And I think in China, the renewable targets allocated to provinces and supported by mechanisms were far more effective in achieving deliveries so far than this carbon market by itself. And I think this is somehow also what we see in Europe now, that we really need to go back and think, what are the primary deep changes that we need? What are the modernizations that we want to support for our industry, for our power sector, for our construction sector? And how can then different instruments, including the carbon market, support it? And if I now look at Europe, we want to get climate neutral by 2045. And this requires that we shift to clean steel production, that we have more recycling, higher shares of recycling, and far better use of materials in the industry sector, as one example. And that means we have to tailor the carbon market to make sure that we can finance clean steel production. So that's where we have this carbon contracts for differences as a complement. And we need to find ways of making sure that consumers contribute and have incentives along the value chain, which we are still exploring whether the CBAM or such a climate contribution option could be the place. So really thinking from the deep transformation, which is the modernization of our economies, and thinking from this as a priority objective, what design elements are important then for it.
Great, thank you so much. I'll now come to you, Arvind, again, and actually club this question for both you and Kaushik, which is as representatives of the harder to abate sectors. How do you think the upcoming Indian carbon market should aim for deep decarbonization of these sectors eventually, but particularly bringing in the MSME supply chains as well, because that's where often some of the opportunities for decarbonization still lie. So
I would like to repeat what I said. For a deep decarbonization, target setting will be very important, especially MSME. And MSME doesn't have the necessary capacity and capability, and also the policies are not favoring to them. Especially after COVID, still the MSME sector is struggling to be on their own, and a lot of support would be required, especially for deep decarbonization. My company is very matured. We have set a target for carbon negativity by 2040, and many of our peers, Tatas, Birlas, and others, they are also at a matured level. But there has to be a different size for different fits for different sizes, and you can't have one straight fit for everybody. That's what my say would be. Hope that was the question, or you expect
right,
something?
But I was just wondering if for MSMEs you have any particular design suggestion, because it doesn't look like they'll be included in the first round unless Scope 3 is included or some kind of cluster approach. Is there a way for them to provide offsets, you think?
I think we need to first build the awareness, and larger companies are definitely have started. Like we have a supply chain sustainability program, and we have been engaging with them, but not all of them. Like if you have 3,000, 4,000 of the suppliers, we had selected based on the 80-20 or the spend basis, and we have been doing the capacity building with them. Similar mechanism that's for our supplier, but there will be many other suppliers who will be participating into it. So efforts needs to be made, on the capacity building or the awareness or the training, hand-holding of these people. And otherwise, there will be a failure. And if they have to buy allowances from the market, their cost will go up. If their cost goes up, our cost will also go up. So it's going to impact the entire industry by way of, having eroding the bottom line. So we need to be very careful, right? If we want to include MSME sector right in the beginning, we have to do the capacity building and hand holding. Without that, I think we should not step into.
Great, thanks. Kaushik.
Yeah, thanks. So before I get into the MSME question, I think fundamentally the decarbonization journey anywhere in the world has a cost. It's not a free run. And that cost economics of sustainability of a business, both from a carbon point of view as well as from its own business sustainability perspective, has to be kind of looked at in totality. And if I then look at what are the decarbonization ecosystem that one builds around an organization, it is the customers, it is the suppliers, it is the government as policymakers, internal and external. And that's why there are companies, and we do it in India, we started internal carbon pricing at least 5-6 years back for our OPEX and CAPEX decisions. It hurts us in some ways. I think we heard the fact that in steel making, if you use more scrap, you reduce your CO2. But scrap is at dead cost. Your productivity goes down. The customer may or may not pay. Like what Arvind said, the cost of the cement bags have not increased, so it goes per the cycle. But that's a target, and that's the pathway. So one is a 2070. For us, we've set 2045. But those are, it will not happen like a magic switch. You have to work towards a pathway and improve incrementally every year, every month, every quarter, on a certain trajectory where every participant has a role to play. So when we are looking at decarbonization, the first thing obviously is measurement. And you do measurement on GHG protocols, you will include scope 3 also, scope 2, scope 3, which is where all participants come in. Now, everybody, the heavy lifting has to be done by the main company, right? That's where the heavy lifting will be, depending on the proportionality of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. But fundamentally, one has to understand that we will have to ensure that our value chain or supply chain also is on board to ensure that they follow that path. So we are, for example, part of the Responsible Steel Alliance, where we want to ensure that between the shipping company, the iron ore supplier or the coal supplier, to the local suppliers, everybody is onboarded. The first bit on MSMEs is awareness and build capacity and capability. The first question they would say, why should we do it? What's the incentive? And how do you put him on board that we will have to take the bulk of the heavy lifting, but you need to be participative on this. And this is actually not true, not only relevant only in carbon, it is also relevant in the entire SDG space, starting from human rights to looking at all the 17 SDG elements. But in carbon in particular, when we measure the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 on GHG, then you have the pathways built. The second, and this is becoming more, the pressure is more because now with the International Sustainability Standard Board being formed, the taxonomy is going to become clearer and clearer. And once the taxonomy becomes clearer, you report on that basis. When you get report on that basis, the measurement is clear. When the measurement is clear, the mitigation pathway has to be built on that. So, which will have investments, and the competitiveness has to be kept in mind, because with CBAM, it's become important that the exports are as important as imports. So therefore, like in financial terms, you have double taxation treaties. I foresee that in times to come, you will have carbon taxation treaties. Because if it is a globalized world with exports and imports moving freely, there will be a mechanism, and I think G20 will be the platform, where that mechanism has to be built, that if I were to export, there are already FTAs happening. And within that FTA, CBAM is going to get built in, because nobody is going to bear the carbon leakage of another country in their country. So therefore, that equalization will happen, which is why I refer to a double taxation treaty in financial terms, you will have this, and therefore the whole world will see that there is a merit or there is a value in improving the climate and work towards it and invest that. And I think that is what India needs. India is in a phase where you have multi-decadal infrastructure being built. If you impose carbon tax, then the cost of that infrastructure may become much larger. The point that Arvind talked about in terms of India as a growth economy. And you don't also want that the imports coming in cheap, where the domestic players are going to pay the carbon tax. So therefore India, when it has the carbon market principles, must have a principles of also carbon border tax adjustment in some form or the other as a placeholder. These two will work together in terms of maturing. I think the point made that even in EU ETS it's 40%. We as a country and the size of the economy, 40% is pretty large. If we can get 40% in, we will get the MSMEs in eventual course.
Great. Tejashree, Diksha, I wonder if I might request you to continue in the same theme of MSMEs capacity building.
Or even for Birla's two very hard to abate sectors. We are the largest cement maker and also aluminium there, and therefore I think two things which need to go in together is how, and this is something which we've kind of addressed by the way of working at global industry level, like what he spoke about at steel. So whether it's at International Aluminium Institute or Global and Cement and Concrete Makers Association, is that how you develop the corporate targets and how industry targets and therefore country targets move across that needs to be aligned. And to the point that was made earlier in terms of for China, what is it that we want to do with this whole thing? So, do we want to expand the coverage? Ultimately, I mean, while it's clear that we want to bring down the carbon emissions and use that as a tool, but then tool should not, or the markets should not become the end. It's the means to get there. And to get the means, so through that means, what do you want to do? Do we want to move up in the GHG mitigation hierarchy? And if we want to move up in the GHG mitigation hierarchy and say that the deep impact in cement will come out of finding an alternative to high use of thermal energy, or an alternative to the raw material itself. And if those are low TRL kind of solutions or levers to decarbonize, is it that one of the fundamental things we would want to move by the way of a carbon market is to encourage by a sector adoption and more work on low TRL technologies, which could have a high carbon reduction? So, coming out with what will be those hard things that we want to do, along with some easy things which are happening. So like, inclusion of MSME through that, and I would even link it to, I've been carefully reading through the consultation paper that SEBI's put out. And there, one of the changes that you would see, they're talking about BRSR, is that should supply chain be included. So supply chain needs to be included is understood by everyone. Now it's about the time and readiness to do it. And therefore, what do we want to achieve by each of these pieces? Is it that in first couple of years, you focus on, and I saw that list of whatever, 13, 14 things that can be, those are the levers to decarbonize. Which one are we, where do we think for a sector, the bang for the buck is? Like, is it that in the hard to abate sectors, it is about those solutions which are in the future, and therefore, the kind of carbon credits that would come out of it, and the buyers of carbon credits that we want to have. Do we want to create these niche combinations of low TRL technology in cement, working with certain, in a bilateral with another country where the solutions are coming up? Because one thing we seem seemed to be missing from what was there in Kyoto Protocol is the whole technology transfer piece. So we have continued to talk about carbon. So ET has stayed, CDM, JI we are talking about. One fundamental thing which went under it, and that was the idea 15, 17 years back, was this whole thing of how do we upgrade the technology to become more carbon efficient. So are we thinking of those? And it is not either this or that, it is this and that. So therefore, for MSMEs, maybe they would operate in the first band of the GHG mitigation hierarchy. So how to help them become more energy efficient, how to help them switch to renewable energy. So all those less than $10 marginal cost of abatement things. Maybe for certain set of, for hard to abate, it would be those between $30 to $50 kind of thing. And of course, if it is $80, $100 plus, then it has to come from a sovereign funding. So is that another thing that's going to come about? That, do we use the whole concept of marginal cost of abatement of carbon to decide, say, these are the different parts in which this is going to operate, and for these bits, this is what carbon markets would do, and for these bits, this is what. So that would be my thought.
So I think I'll very quickly just summarize a couple of points I wanted to make. When we talk about MSMEs, I think we need to keep in perspective that they form 30% of the GDP. So it's a huge impact. And likewise, their activities also aggregate up to the similar kind of impact in terms of carbon space. So, but the fact remains that today they are at a very, I would say, a very beginner's level in terms of awareness. Many of them are starting their journey. I would definitely say that, because, and a lot of push has come from large companies in terms of making their whole supply chain more greener and moving towards more sustainable value chain approach. But they are at a very nascent stage. Capacity building, I think, has to be the biggest focus in this at the start of this journey for MSMEs. But at the same time, I think the benefit, why would they do this? A lot of compulsions are coming on large companies in terms of not only declaring their sustainability targets, their ambitions, but also on being transparent in terms of how are they moving their whole supply chain on this sustainability aspects, and carbon being one of the most important indicator to demonstrate that. So this kind of coming as a demand from consumers, especially from the B2B kind of a business requirements, the whole momentum on moving MSMEs towards this journey is taking more and more speed. Having said that, MSMEs today are also aspiring to be exporters, more and more moving towards going beyond the boundaries, looking at doing businesses beyond just domestic supply and demand. And the one incentive of moving them on this journey is basically to prepare them for those border taxes which would come up, making them more competitive, making them more aware about what is entailed for them if they want to go on that growth trajectory that today India is aspiring, and likewise all the businesses are, including MSMEs. So I think there is a lot of benefit for each player in the game, and while we do that, if the abatement cost, marginal abatement cost for carbon comes down by a market mechanism, I think there would be takers anyways for this. So we cannot have a blind spot for a 30% impacting entity on the GDP, likewise on the carbon space. But at the same time, there needs to be a calibrated approach in terms of how do this sector gets handheld by players who are already there, and make those benefits very visible in terms of these entities to move on this journey, so that they find that this is going to really help them in terms of moving the needle up for the business and the boundaries up to which they are today, aspiring to do business. So just.
Great, thank you. Varad, Bose, you can address the same question, of course, but I was wondering if, given your experience, you might want to also reflect a little bit on the legal and regulatory aspects and issues of MRV and price controls as well.
Okay. Regulatory aspect when it comes to actually carbon trade, I think it's been raised in many forums. There could be transaction tax as an issue. It's not been resolved. Probably within India, and if we allow cross-border, how carbon as a commodity will be treated, accounting and taxation. So that's a regulatory issue that's not really resolved. Other than that, I mean, regulatorily, unless this mechanism is anchored into a regulation, I think that is probably why some of our programs have not really succeeded. Under our renewable energy certification program, there is RPO. But we know that program practically failed because, nobody's really complying with it. There's no compliance, nobody has taken anyone to court as far as I know. So, but if it is a regulation and there is legal obligation, I think that's what EU ETS has successfully done. A lot of this anchored on regulations. The participant and the facilities can be sued. There is a real liability and compliance obligation. So I think that has to be obviously. It should be calibrated. I mean, once you create regulations, they are liable to, comply, and by putting undue obligations on them, that industry could fail. So, I mean, it's a space that has to be really carefully, and it has to evolve, very, carefully treated.
I'll just add two quick things, one on the competitiveness and one on the MSME. So on the competitiveness, I think, one, and this is a bigger idea, which is, is there a possibility of a grand bargain? And, Ulka, you and I have contributed to something called a white paper on a global climate alliance, right, which was put together by a bunch of think tanks, and Mr. Jayant Sinha, the chair of the Standing Committee on Finance, was very involved in it. But the idea that can countries improve on their Paris pledges and make it like a Paris Plus pledge, and in return get much larger financial transfers and exemptions from things like CBAM for their industries. And of course the details will need to be worked out, but as a conceptual framework, thinking about a grand bargain which helps address some of these upcoming concerns on competitiveness could be an important unlock. On the SMEs, I would say, look, I think the big change is we have to move from a project mindset to a product mindset. How do we create a market which is not, like the data which was shown, projects are taking 2 to 3 years for approval, the cost of intermediation is so high, it'll never work for MSMEs, right? So how do we create both standards, digital infrastructure, so that all of this stuff can become much easier to do, much more cost effective? I think that could play a very important role in bringing, in addition to, of course, awareness and capacity building, which was mentioned here. And then I think, again, just to emphasize, I think I'm seeing a lot of activity amongst startups who are willing to come and help MSMEs to then play in this market. But those layers of common standards, digital infrastructure, to lower the cost of intermediation will be very important for MSMEs to play in this space.
Great, thank you. Let's now just see if there are any questions from the audience, if there's any questions, comments. I see one hand. Anyone else? Okay, 3, 4. All right, I think that's it. We'll close it with those 4. Someone pass the mics. And Shubhangi, let me know if there is anything online as well that you'd like me to take up. I can't. Yeah? Okay.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, quick introduction. My name is Sanjay and I work for actually a fund called Avishkar Capital, quite similar to Omidar. we're raising a fund to invest in community-based projects, which will ultimately lead to carbon offsets through nature-based sequestration. So my question was quite simple. I mean, much of the discussion today, and all of the discussion today was actually around the compliance markets very broadly, which is how it should really be. You know, it's part of the NDC goals. But as some of the leading corporates also having international businesses looking at net zero goals, how do you see the role of a voluntary market playing into this? Towards your own goals, or broadly, you know, how do you see the two markets interacting?
Thanks. We'll take a couple of questions and then we can farm them out. I think you had a question. Yes, please. I'll come to you, sir. Please.
I'm Richard Bright. I'm part of NCCF. I head the carbon vertical for NCCF. We have our own registry, and B has been part of our standard development process. We've been there for past 1 year, and what we've observed is the carbon market as such is largely investor driven. So one question which everyone asks, kitna milega? You know, that is very, in the voluntary space, it is the only question which matters. Today, if you look at the global perspective, any other global registry which is like WRI or gold standard, you will find at least 25 to 30% of projects which are registered from India, including GCC as well. GCC is beyond 40%. The only reason why they are registered abroad is they get higher value. So unless we have the right pricing mechanism and some compliance to have projects in India, and there are buyers in India, what would be your opinion on that, and how do we address that?
Thanks. Was there a question at the back also?
Hello.
Yeah.
Myself, Juan Mandi, and I am a LCA and sustainability specialist from Optel Group. So I have two questions. One question is, we know that EPR, the Extended Producer's Responsibility, is a regulatory measure. And CSR is another initiative, it is more of a social initiative. Is there a mechanism where companies could take credits for their EPR, recycling initiatives, CSR initiatives, etc., and show that they are offsetting carbon? That is one. Second is, if somebody is doing some afforestation measures or some measures on ground, nature-based solutions where they are absorbing carbon dioxide, is there a mechanism where companies could fund this? The ones who are taking initiatives are getting the money, and the companies gets credit for offsetting this. And eventually, you can actually convert it into carbon credits. So these two are my questions.
And last question at this table. Yeah, you. Yes, please. Sorry, sir, next time.
We are from Jivan Bandhu Foundation.
Okay.
And we are undertaking green projects. Louder. We are undertaking green projects which are totally eco-friendly. And my colleague just now who spoke about it, we are in the same line.
Okay.
How if we are implementing green projects, how we can take the carbon credit? And second point, could anyone explain this carbon credit creators, carbon credit buyers, and carbon credit suppliers with few examples? Thank you.
Thank you. Bose, you wanted to start on the voluntary market, right? And then any volunteers for the other questions?
Yeah. Voluntary market is driven by obviously voluntary demand, and just by the description of the market, there is no room for a regulatory play there. But I think that there could be monitoring that can be implemented without intervention. I also think that, as I said, the carbon market, a compliance market, if you implement in India, it's not going to cover 100% of India emissions. So some sectors will be under that. And then there is a huge, most of our offset generation is in the community sector today. To me, that can continue, and that can be available for global consumers, big corporations, it's a foreign revenue earner. I think it can continue. But there are also, I mean, that space, because it's not regulated, has a lot of credibility issues, and that's probably why the prices are really like, you know, below $10 even now for most of the credits. And in the big voluntary market, people have forgotten about key criteria such as additionality, leakage, and permanence, and things like that. So, you know, but the voluntary market, I think it should continue. It can continue. It can coexist with the compliance market, and you know, and it's so there. I mean, unlike a compliance market, we would probably expect emission reduction to be measured directly by the parties. And I think the whole time delay and all that we discussed, 2 years to register, that is for the carbon credits. You know, all this registry is going through the process and getting emission reduction certified as credits, and that's a different process. I think that can continue. Thank you.
Yeah, so if I may just couple of points. One is that offsets in terms of a mitigation hierarchy are the last priority. So which is why a lot of what we've spoken about, at least what I've spoken about, is in terms of, so we are not looking at it that this is compliance, this is voluntary. We're going according to, this is the carbon footprint, and this is where we want to take it. So what you cannot do by the way of all those other measures is what you would like to offset. And therefore, even looking at afforestation, reforestation also would be how we can do some of those projects. So that's first point. Second point towards this is also, for example, for cement, SBTi does not even is not even accepting offsets to be a way to reduce carbon footprint. So therefore, do not look at it as that why have you spoken only about compliance and not voluntary. It is in terms of saying, because then second question would be why are you offsetting and why are you not looking at actual measures that can be. So therefore, we are focusing first in terms of what we can do to actually bring down, and whatever cannot be brought down through those measures, as you go closer to you know, saying that we are getting there but not reaching, is when offsets would come into place, especially for our Indian operations where there are opportunities to bring them down. And similarly, even in our, we have many locations where we operate where there are carbon taxes in place, and there also we would again go according to the mitigation hierarchy, saying, are we being efficient? Can we switch fuel? Can we move to renewable? Can we change the process? If we cannot do any of these, is then you would say, let me look for offsets. So.
Yeah, thanks. So, you know, for a long period of time, offset's been a dirty word. And it's been like, it seems like you're fudging something. And that's been the context. I've been, in the last 3 years, been member of the International Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, and currently sit on the UK Steering Committee for the UK Voluntary Carbon Markets. I think we are moving at a fairly fast pace in establishing credibility to voluntary carbon markets, because there is a growing realization in the world around, while this is residual, it's large, big, and relevant. And the linkage of the voluntary carbon markets to nature-based solutions is the fundamental approach by which you can progress. What do we need to establish credibility? In the same way we talked earlier, we have to have the couple of very critical elements in place. One is, again, definition, taxonomy, registration, market making, market intermediation. It's no different than your financial markets. And unless you have all the players suitably regulated to play their own path, we will not have that. I see that internationally at least, there's a lot of movement through these task forces that I sit in towards establishing it quickly. I also sit in Climate Impact X, which is a platform in Singapore. I sit on their advisory council, which is by the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the Central Bank in Singapore, along with 6 other banks. And they are actively looking, and I think there are multiple Indian projects, and I think somebody mentioned that there are Indian projects getting registered overseas, but there are no such things happening in India. And I think this is where one mind change has to happen, that voluntary carbon markets will be important and perhaps as big as the compliance markets. But to do that, we need to have transparent, credible exchanges and platforms who can do that. When the gentleman asked that we are in sourcing of giving you the carbon credits, where do I find the platform to sell? I think that's the path that India has to also accept, because carbon at a very simplistic level respects no boundaries. So you can't have political boundaries where CO2 is getting stopped. It is a global problem. So you have to solve it by ensuring that this voluntary carbon markets is done through a hub and spoke model across the world, where there is transparency of dealing, credibility of transaction, and improves on the overall kind of hierarchy which he talked about in a proper manner. It's some years away, but I think India will, once you get the carbon compliance market in place, I think the voluntary markets will follow in India. But I think the rest of the world is moving at a much faster pace.
Okay, so
Ulka, just one line to add to.
One line to Tejashree first, and then one line to
Varad. I was just, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Tejashree, go ahead, please.
Only just one point, but with India having a net zero target, unless we develop this in a very robust way in terms of voluntary carbon market, we will see a flight of credits going out. So, to ultimately as a nation to reach that goal, we will have to develop this alongside the compliance market, because unless we do that, whatever the mitigation path we take, the hierarchy path is essential, but there's always going to be a residue, and somebody mentioned that residue is not small, so it is required.
I was just going to say, I think both voluntary markets and compliance markets have to learn from each other. I think the voluntary markets have to learn how, rigor, consensus building, quality, all of these things which have been the hallmark of the development of compliance markets. And compliance markets have to learn speed, agility, using technology more effectively, innovation. I think both can improve if they learn from each other.
Well said. So let me try to close this session now. I'll not attempt to wrap up by summarizing, but I'll borrow the words of our panelists, which is that the carbon market is the means to an end. That end is deep decarbonization. And what that means is that it will entail real obligations, and we want genuine compliance. So for an Indian context, which is one of growth, growing infrastructure and all of that, a carbon market may introduce flexibility which reduces costs within the market, but it might increase costs in the real economy. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. But if there are opportunities, as many of our participants, and in fact the questions from the audience have also shown, then what it needs is capacity building and hand-holding of, as you said, 30% of the GDP, the MSMEs. And finally, what we need is regulatory clarity. So with that, thank you so much for your time and patience. Please do join us for lunch, and we'll come back for the second session, which promises to be even more exciting than this one. But thanks a lot to all the panelists for your time.
Thank you. Carlos, without further ado, I give it on to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani. Well, I will take the first 5 minutes to set up certain questions for the design of the carbon markets, and then head on for some questions to our panelists, for both our virtual attendance and our physical attendance over here. And the first place I would like to start by saying it was a fantastic initiative by the group of stakeholders that participated with WRI-India in the notional market, the launch of the pilot market to begin to learn about design. Because what is the best way to understand about how something works if beginning to prototype it, create fast prototyping of new versions, and then let it out, begin to recognize what its advantages and its pitfalls are. I would frame, and I'm going to be framing this according to the different questions that emerging economies have been asking regarding the carbon markets. And it's because if India is going to learn anything from carbon markets, it would learn from the experience of similar countries to India. Middle-income countries, we need to get together and learn about how carbon markets can work for us. European, the US regional markets are very well, they have been running for a long time and there are many lessons there, but also we need to think about our particular circumstances. So my first question, I would set this up in terms of 7 basic questions. The first one is, which sectors are we going to let in, are going to be regulated through the market? And what are the thresholds of emissions? So it's basically going to be big industry with emissions beyond 10,000 tons. Those questions will be sent to our international panelists. How do you choose which sectors and how big do the firms need to be? And then the second one is how much are we going to be asking of the firms and the sectors that are being regulated? And how much are we going to be asking means, is it a 2% reduction? Is it a 5% reduction over the following 5 years? That is the main restriction. The idea that there's a cap, the cap begins to fall over time to meet the contribution, meets the national contributions or the contribution of that sector to the national goals. It is the most important decision. So it's who has to comply, how fast are limits going to be tightened up to meet the national standard. And here, India has a very particular challenge. Thankfully, the metric by which the country decided how much to reduce was not absolute emissions, like those countries already industrialized, already with high incomes did. It did more or less like Mexico and the other countries, middle-income countries, that decided to do an intensity-based target. An intensity-based target means emissions per $1 million of GDP, per million pesos, per million rupees. This idea of measuring this because we have a large shares of our population living in poverty, because we still have to grow the industrial sector fast and green, and because of that, the metric is in intensity. And how do you use an intensity-based target and convert that into a carbon market? You need, if the market is measured in tons and the metrics is measured in tons per unit of GDP, there needs to be some conversion. What other middle-income countries did was to have an absolute target over a baseline, and the baseline was increasing, saying the country is industrializing, growing as emerging economies do, growing fast, growing slow, growing sometimes fast and sometimes slow with great variability. Well, how do we adapt to that uncertain environment? And there, the way of converting emissions per unit of GDP into targets for specific industries, for specific sectors, is key. Now, the third question, and this is when we began to experiment, is should we allocate or should we auction? Should we allocate freely, give free allowances, or should a share be auctioned at the beginning? And the temptation and the gains from those two are very clear. If you auction, the government receives money that can channel for a faster deployment of green energies. But if it's free allowances, then firms are stronger. They have something they can trade later on. If they want to just stay within their own limits and not interact with the market, then that's okay. They have a limit. They can do internal work to comply with the target there. So there's an advantage in allocating freely. There's an advantage in making auctions. And the study also asked, or the design in different countries has answered this question, which is, what is the best way to trade? Should it be a secondary market? Should it be open? Anyone can enter the market. Should it be limited to offsets for certain sectors, for certain activities? Who can enter the trade and what are the best ways to trade? And the WRI's report, WRI analysis, showed that coming at a certain, all actors coming in with sealed bids at a specific moment in time, quarterly, every certain amount of predicted period, and entering everyone in the market creates a liquid market for countries like ours that would have a few number of actors. So coming together to trade and discovering the price. Finally, the other question is how to connect with other markets, how to connect with other sectors that are not regulated, how to connect with other countries. And here's the promise, because if prices for carbon are very high in economies that already have exploited the low-hanging fruits, the main opportunities, then countries like Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, India will have many opportunities out there to begin to open up the new technologies and make low-cost carbon reductions and begin to sell them internationally. So Article 6 has this promise, and we will be asking our panelists about that. And finally, the interaction with different economies, the interaction through different instruments, not carbon markets, but related to carbon markets. And here we have 2 or 3 connections that are probably the ones that are receiving the focus now. One of them would be strong measures like carbon border adjustments. One of them, if a country has or not a carbon tax, has or not a carbon market, it doesn't matter. It will be facing the possibility of having carbon border adjustments by their European economies, by importers of our products from Europe will be saying, well, if your country doesn't have a carbon price, it will be adjusted through a tariff. The other interaction is through subsidies, like when the US begins to have the Inflation Reduction Act and delivering subsidies, government support for a faster transition, that's also an interaction. The international markets will be connected through sectors that are receiving strong government support to make a faster deployment, to make a faster transition. So these interactions with hard measures, with subsidies, are going to be there present. And how do we design our carbon markets to deal with those external interactions are going to be important. We'll be hearing from our panelists about how do they see that perspective, how that connection that will happen can be done in the best way. Finally, we have some questions regarding should prices in markets be controlled? Should we have bounds for prices not to get too high or not to get too low? And that is also a consideration. But let me stop here and begin to ask our series of panelists what do they think about these different topics. And 1 second. I would like to start with Juan Carlos Arredondo, a colleague of mine of many years that was involved precisely answering these 5 or 6 questions for 2 or 3 economies now, I guess. And the question, Juan Carlos, is how do you decide, or how the international experience regarding which sectors, which limits, at what threshold do you start trading, and how to allocate, allow for new firms coming in or expansion of existing firms, how do you solve those design issues, and what do you think India could learn from what we have learned in the rest of the world, in the rest of the middle-income economies or in the global south economies that have begun to interact with carbon markets? Juan Carlos.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, WRI, and everyone for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I guess the 2 or 3 questions that you asked really felt like 20 questions, because all of them, when answered, represent the technical design of an emissions trading system in a country. Now you have to find answers to every single one of those questions for you to have finally properly design your system. And I will start with why do you want to have an emissions trading system? No, the objective of the emissions trading system in a jurisdiction is first and foremost question that you have to ask yourself as a country, particularly as a middle-income country. Why do you want this? In some cases, it's because you want to raise revenue, for the government in a certain way, or it's because you want some specific sectors to find their mitigation options and to incentivize for them to undertake those mitigation options. Or do you want certain sectors to contribute to the national targets that you have for yourself for 2030 or 2040 or 2050 or so on? So defining the objective of your cap and trade emissions trading system is the first question to ask. A second part of that is precisely who you bring to the table. Who should be the one regulated by this new system? And assuming that what you want is to reduce emissions in the most cost-effective way in your jurisdiction, obviously you will be looking into those sectors who are the high emitters. No, that's the rationale usually that many systems follow in their design in terms of, I would say, choosing the usual suspects, power generation, cement, steel, refineries, oil and gas, and so on. Because in each facility, you will have a lot of emissions compared to other sources of emissions, for instance, transport. That you will have a lot of emissions, but it is split across many different individuals or activities. So the choice of the sectors is in relation to how do you want them to contribute to your.
So Juan Carlos, you're saying that Mexico chose to regulate very few large industries because those were the ones who were going to change.
Basically, in our case, what we did is by analyzing the emissions profile of the country, at the national level, the national emissions inventory, identify the big sectors that were contributing the most. And then when we went into the specific reports from some of those facilities, we saw that 300 companies, 300 facilities were emitting more than 60% of the national emissions.
Okay, so go for the 300 largest ones and let the others go free? That was the option?
Not necessarily go free, but those were the first that become regulated under the ETS.
Great.
So the next part of the question is how do you allocate the allowances?
Yes, but remember, Juan Carlos, you have the 300 that are being regulated with the market, but the rest are facing a carbon tax, and that's the interaction. For the rest of the economy, you apply the tax, and for the 300 largest ones, you go for the market. Isn't that part of the solution?
Part of the solution is precisely indicating to all of the economic activities that emitting CO2 or any other greenhouse gases has a cost. So the notion of putting a price on carbon is essential, and it's part of the mix of policies that you can create for a country. In the case of Mexico, and has been the case in other jurisdictions as well, for instance, we decided to have a carbon tax that is universally applicable to anyone who imports or commercializes fossil fuels. But then, within that universe of economic activities, you also have the facilities that may be using those fuels, but that become a large source of emission. And those are the ones regulated by the emissions trading system. So you have two complementary policies that are acting in a country to indicate that you need to reduce emissions.
Okay, perfect. Now, I would like to be switching, but I'll return to you, so don't go away far. I will ask Pedro Martins about what have we learned from the clean development mechanism that could serve us for the Article 6 world. And it's obvious. If you are in the market, you would like to be selling carbon credits, carbon reductions. We would like to be always on the selling side. Who wants to be on the buying side? Well, what did we learn from the clean development mechanism and the way to use trade to reduce emissions at the least costly way?
So, well, first of all, thank you, and thank you WRI for the invitation. So I have to say I was knee deep into CDM territory. I was actually a member of the CDM executive board some 12 years ago when the CDM was a big thing. What did we learn? We learned, first of all, that the CDM was the largest crediting mechanism. So it is the template for all other crediting mechanisms to date, let's face it. We also learned that you could do an international mechanism under the United Nations, that it was feasible, that it could work. But from a buyer's perspective, there were some issues with the CDM. And it led, and those issues eventually led to a certain extent to its demise. There are many things that are going to be translated over to the Article 6. Mm-hmm. In particular for Article 6.4, for those who follow, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement has two separate, let's say, set of mechanisms. Article 6.2, which is really about providing a framework for international trading of mitigation outcomes, which are not really well defined in the article itself. So essentially, it's a way of acting as a kind of an umbrella for potentially linking emissions trading systems, for example, mm-hmm. or linking between an emissions trading system and a crediting system internationally. And then you have Article 6.4, which is really the successor mechanism to the Clean Development Mechanism, in the sense that Article 6.4 mechanism will be centralized, it will be run by the UN, there will be people, thankfully not me anymore, at the supervisory board, it's called now. But we already know it will be using a lot of the methodologies that were developed under the CDM, which are in effect a global public good. Anyone can use those methodologies.
And India participated strongly in CDM.
India was one of the biggest participants in the CDM, and a lot of effort was done by Indian entrepreneurs in, for example, in developing such methodologies. So a lot of that infrastructure, we hope, will be used now under the Article 6.4 mechanism. However, there is something fundamentally different now in the context. And we're discussing all of this here, so I don't think I need to emphasize this. But basically, under Kyoto, India did not have any commitments, or the vast majority of developing countries. Now you do have a commitment. And with that commitment comes an opportunity cost to engaging in Article 6. And I thought quite interestingly, I just heard this a few days ago, that the ministry here in India has already decided 13 activities that would be, let's say, favored by India in its participation in Article 6.4. And I have to say, kudos to India, because not that many countries in the developing world have already thought that through. But essentially, you don't want to, and this is something that I've been saying for many years, you as a developing country do not want to engage in an international mechanism now if that opportunity cost of engagement comes back to you, i.e. if by selling away the cheap emission reductions, you're then forced under the mechanism of corresponding adjustments to actually take on other reductions elsewhere.
So it would be double counting?
Well, in order to avoid double counting, you have then to, as India, you have to reduce elsewhere. And that's the problem. It's not that this is impeding all kind of participation in the international market. Not at all, not by any means. But it means that you have to have a much smarter, more intelligent, and more focused way of participating in particular on Article 6.
But Mr. Mertens, we have seen other markets get together and fuse. For example, the regional markets in the US, or California and the provinces in Canada. Those have been, both of those economies, regional economies, had restrictions, had limits Everybody needed to reduce their emissions. And they still got together in a single market and gained from that. So what do you see there?
Well, but those are, let's say, limited experiences. And I'll explain why it's limited. We're talking, first of all, in the case of California and Quebec, for example, we're talking about subnational governments. These subnational governments are not bound by the Paris Agreement. The national governments are, but for both Canada and the US, it is more or less irrelevant whether California or Quebec, when trading, which one of them has a surplus in the end in the trading. Let me tell you a counterexample. Switzerland, geographically inset in the middle of the European Union, couldn't be more of a bound economy with the European Union. If you go through Switzerland, you understand what I mean. It's right in the middle. 80% of its trade is with the EU. It took the European Union and Switzerland more than 3 years of very tough negotiations to get to an agreement on linking the two regimes. And those were very tough and very high-level discussions. So even those that are, you'd almost say like they're a perfect match, geographically, culturally, etc., it is difficult to link.
Okay.
So one of the things, and going back to your list that you mentioned, you put in there linkages to other markets. One of the things that I would want to say as you in India start thinking about your domestic carbon market, yes, by all means, think about the potential to link to other markets, because that is in itself a good, a flexibility that you owe it to yourself. But do not make that a prime objective. You have to think for yourself as India, what is the objective that you're pursuing with having a carbon market? Just like Juan Carlos is saying, I remember when we did the EU ETS back in 2003, that's when the first legislation.
Yep.
The EU ETS was solely aimed at reducing carbon emissions. Today it's about much more than that and much more complex discussion. But going back to that, yes, linking is good. Linking can be done. It's tough, but can be done. But do not go into linking for the sake of it.
Yep. It's just the opportunities are there. Well, let me then begin to pivot there regarding one of the ideas that was discussed this morning, which is we will learn from the voluntary carbon markets, and then with that knowledge and that experience, we'll get to the formalized, the regulation-based or the restrictive carbon markets, the obligations. So I would like to ask Ms. Acharya to tell us what does she think about the way voluntary carbon markets did channel finance to begin to accelerate transitions, and what can be learned for the Indian market now moving forward if this design begins to emerge. So please, Ms. Acharya.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, to WRI, for having me at this panel. It's good to see this discussion. I think before I respond to that question, maybe I would, I might even remind the audience that some of these questions are being discussed inside the Bureau for Energy Efficiency, the Ministry of Power. They're the people who are designing and designing the emissions trading scheme now. So I'd really urge WRI to make connection or involve them in these discussions, because just a few days ago, and I think it was Pedro who just said that just a few days ago, there are a number of sectors which are eligible for Article 6.2 have been notified, quote unquote notified. And you will see that the thinking behind that notification is largely based on input costs of technology. So there is a lot of thinking that's already going on there, and it'd just be nice to merge the two. Now that said, there's of course a whole lot more thinking that needs to be done, and it needs to be, I think it could benefit from bringing in experience from, I think somebody was saying from the large economies. I would say from other countries that have gone through the same sort of thinking back in the day. 20 years ago, Ulka Kelkar and I used to do these workshops. And at that time, they used to be around CDM and how do we do a project. It was in India. And then life went on, and there were discussions inside the European Union, exactly as Pedro was saying, on exactly why is the EU going into an emission trade scheme. So life went on from thereafter. I think there's another big chunk to be had now, and that's around questions such as the one you just asked me, finance. You know, there's a big discussion in the CDM era. What is additional and what's not additional? And for as long as it's considered, by the time you finish that answering that question, your project has probably gone through your investment. And although in the best of cases, developers would have put the consideration of carbon revenues into that project, it never really played a part. And that was a little bit of a tragedy, because when we started thinking about this business, that was the whole idea, that hopefully this carbon money would change things at the margins of investment. Now, fast forward thereafter, because life has changed, solar power in India is cheaper than new coal. We're having an energy transition discussion inside India that is so serious that we're willing to put saying carbon money is eligible for that amount of solar power that is only contained in the stored section.
Yeah.
So where we can use carbon finance, when we say, can we use it for financing, what does that really mean? Let me put an example out here. I've just come out of building out perhaps the biggest electric bus program, and WRI was very involved and helped me to put this out there. If you put at $10 a ton or $15 a ton, you're getting about 5% of the total value of the bus, which is nothing. From an investment point of view, that's not why you do a changeover into buses. But it becomes very material when you say that, you know, that little piece of money is going to help me bring down the risk for a state government or any sort of large utility to move over completely to electric. I'm not talking about 20 and 30 buses. I'm talking about 15,000 and 17,000 buses have been tendered out. This is about $3.5 billion US dollars. Now, yes, that $3.5 billion is not going to look at some 5% of carbon money that's coming on the side. That's not why the $3.5 billion is coming in. But when that carbon money is integrated inside it, and this is the one second chance we have to get this done properly, is to design a scheme that allows that the discussion between the buyer and the seller, for as long as the scheme is silent on it, you can do what you like on an OTC basis, that sort of money be integrated completely into the investment. That's one, even if it's 4 to 5%. There is a prevailing sense in a number of sectors in the country that in order for India to transition to successfully transition over in its energy sector, the more expensive ways of finding most common thinking is to put out a subsidy, but subsidies are not sustainable. So you do that and you hope the demand picks up, but that's not it. Right? You want to have a longer term relationship. So there, I think the voluntary carbon markets have somewhat of, I think you can borrow from that, but I think the one big setback, I can't say setback, I mean, it's something we would have to work on, is this project by project way of doing things is perhaps not the way anymore.
It could be too slow for what is needed now. So it is program by program.
It's too slow for what is needed. It's too opportunistic to make a difference. It also relies very heavily on what is still right now a subjective verification exercise. It's human-led and therefore subjective. We have to put a technology layer over that entire MRV system, and that's the only way you can scale. So I would say 3 or 4 things have to just be pulled and brought back into the system for accounting, where you'd be able to do transactions on a wholesale basis.
Yes, certainly, yes. Markets that work are markets that have low transaction costs that can move. And well, let me connect this idea to one thought here about connecting international markets. So, Mr. Nahabadi, do you think that India needs a carbon market of its own to leverage carbon markets internationally? So, in a sense, the NDC of India, the National Determined Contribution, is quite ambitious. It will be reducing by 2030 a significant amount of the emissions per unit of GDP. So having such ambition and wanting to leverage international carbon markets, can that be done without having a carbon market of its own or not?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a challenging question, if I may just step back. So if you look at India's current NDC, which is, as you mentioned, it's emission intensity based. And if we just do pure modeling based on economics, where technology costs are today, as was mentioned earlier by Ms. Mahua, already renewable costs in India are quite competitive. And also the auction mechanisms that India has had around renewable procurement have been quite competitive. So in short, if I may express my personal opinion, looking at from the perspective of the current NDC, the need for using carbon markets, particularly in international linkage, may not be necessary. Just to step back, if you look at investment flows in energy transition technologies in India, India globally already ranks the eighth, and it outperforms actually its relative to some other economies in the region. Actually, India is doing better than, say, Japan and Korea, which you would have expected to be sort of ahead of it, but they're not. India is actually outperforming them. Having said that, if I may, again, personal opinion, if you look at India's 2030 NDC, it would be helpful if that could actually be set at a more ambitious level. If you look at the cumulative NDCs of the countries today, if we actually achieve all those NDCs, including the conditional NDCs, we're still talking about emissions in 2030 being roughly on par with 2019, meaning that we're nowhere near the trajectory that we need to be for well below 2 degrees. So from that perspective, if India wanted to say that it's willing to use a linkage through an international carbon mechanism to achieve a more ambitious NDC, then I think that's a worthwhile consideration. But with the current target, to be very blunt, I think the current target is not that ambitious, and it will likely be achieved without any sort of additional mechanism.
Okay, great. So the main linkages would be technology, investment, so the other kind of financial flows, but certainly a target that allows India to grow as fast as possible with the lowest carbon footprint would be a challenge if that is not done. Well, then let me link back to our other two speakers, and I would like first to ask Ms. Arora, thinking about the other mechanisms, the other things happening in the rest of the world in the trading partners of India, which would be on the one hand the threat, the possibility of having a carbon border adjustment, a tariff that makes Indian exports more expensive to reach European markets, whereas in European markets that are having an increasing price of carbon and thus losing competitiveness versus the rest of the world would be leveling the playing field by using these carbon border adjustments. Or the strategy in the US, which is something that is putting the World Trade Organization in a TC by saying we need to solve this idea of large amount of subsidies coming to industries for good causes to accelerate technological change, but they are still subsidies as the WTO would think about it. So, Ms. Arora, what worries you more, the carbon budget adjustments, subsidies, or you think everything will flow with the adaptation of India's industrial sector?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the interesting question, and thank you to my co-panelists also. I think it's important to really mention that certainly there will be an impact on India with respect to this, different types of carbon border adjustment mechanisms being talked about, whether it is the Green Deal or it is the, the CBAM, etc. Because if we only look at Europe itself and look at only one sector, I think iron and steel, and we had some representatives there from that sector, I'm sure, in the morning session and maybe even now. This sector itself, is going to get really affected by the proposed European Union CBAM levy. And I think while we understand that, while Europe decarbonizes, and the level playing field for their own, in industry's competitiveness is essential, I think it is going to be something that will hurt, countries that are exporting into Europe, which is even, which is India included there. So certainly industry is worried about it. It's not that industry is not doing anything about it. I mean, industry does realize that it doesn't have to lose its market. The government, as you know, is looking at the WTO mechanism. Whether that will work or not, we don't know. Some of the, at COP27, some of the countries like India, China, Brazil have created a coalition to oppose this carbon border taxes, etc. But from the industry point of view, I think industry is understanding the need to accelerate decarbonization or look at sources of, their products, because a lot of our Indian companies are now global. So they do operate outside India as well. So they will not want to lose their market, and rather they would like to, source, the product from and invest in producing, let's say, green steel from destinations within Europe, because they anyways have to comply with European norms of decarbonization.
But Ms. Arora, if I may interrupt now, the indicator that would trigger the response by the European importers or the WTO would not be the carbon content of the good itself, which I would expect the industry in India would keep on advancing, introducing new technologies, having a more efficiency. I would expect that to happen. But the point is that these are based on the carbon prices. And carbon prices, as Mr. Arredondo would tell us, either come from carbon taxes or from the price that the carbon market in India would show. It would show it is at $5 per ton or at $10 per ton. And that is what would trigger the response. So I understand your optimism for the continuous technological change and the improvement in industry. But if you do not have a price, either in the form of the tax or a price in the market, you would still be in trouble, wouldn't you?
Yeah, so for that reason, I think India is going to have its own Indian carbon market and compliance carbon market, as you already probably know. In the morning, we had the DG of Bureau of Energy Efficiency, where hard-to-abate sectors would be a part of this a compliance market, the Indian national carbon market, and they will be also given targets. The designated entities, the PAT entities themselves are being considered to be converted into this, to be brought into this Indian carbon market, and they would be given targets, annual targets. They'll have to comply. They'll be given certificates. So we are going to have an Indian carbon market. The price discovery, we don't know what the price would be, but I think in response to what you're saying, and the government also is seized with it, because we know that there is going to be a carbon market in India, which is primarily the objective, and that was mentioned by the earlier, I think Joan Carlos mentioned, the objective for the Indian carbon market, as we understand, is basically to contribute to the NDCs of India, get the industry, the hard-to-abate sector to make the transition to contribute to the NDCs of India, and in a way also protect by having your own, mechanism of carbon pricing, carbon tax, instruments where you can go give a price to the carbon. You are also trying to also find a way to respond to what is happening in Europe, etc. When it comes to US, I think I read it a little differently. I think that's definitely something is subsidizing the domestic industry, and hence yes, needs to be studied more carefully in the international trade regime, etc. But every country's sovereign nation has the right to protect their industry.
No, yes, but I agree with you. The learning process will be important. And while the Europeans have been warning us about the CBAM and we have studied it more, certainly they move towards strong subsidies. And I would say that both Canada and Mexico regarding automobiles had a good move. They discussed under the trade agreement between the three countries with its own rules and the WTO. And now domestic content in terms of cars means North American content. Anything that comes from the three countries is considered domestic and thus can be part of the transition. So given the trade agreements India has, probably going over that homework, doing that homework, revising how would they look as the other countries move equally as well, that could be a solution. Well, it sounds that a potential response is over there, and I would certainly see that the signal is there. I tell my colleagues in Mexico that you have a carbon price around between $3 and $5 per ton. If we get the carbon market going as Mr. Arredondo would expect, we would see another $5, $10. So we're already $5 and $10, $15. Then we are in the area where nobody can tell us anything regarding CBAM or subsidies. And with the free trade agreement moving as well, I hope that materializes. But then let me go with Ms. Goswami, where you are in contact with industrial organizations, associations, in a sense, being in contact with all the economic sectors. You hear their concerns, you hear what they see in the horizon. What do you think is the most worrisome thing for the industries in India, the different industries in India, especially the exporting ones or the importing ones, looking into the future of carbon pricing? What do you see as the most important signals that we as a group could be beginning to look at?
Of course, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Sorry. Thank you very much for having me. And as a what do you call a caveat, let me say, unlike everybody else who has core competency in this area, my core competency is actually asking questions. So let me sort of take your question and tell you what the questions that arise in my mind, which could probably be an answer or maybe prelude to more questions for you. Perfect. So one of the things that strikes me when we talk about CBAM, and not the IRA so much, because the thing about the IRA which is making news, or which is its lack of WTO compliance, is the domestic content thing. You must remember that India has been through that dance before. And actually it's the Americans who took us to the WTO dispute resolution over domestic content for solar sort of modules.
And how did that end?
Oh, well, we know how that ended. It didn't end very well for us. And it's interesting that the Americans are doing the same thing. Our PLI, therefore, the production-linked incentives are WTO compliant, therefore. So, very good. So, in a sense, we learned from that experience. Perfect. And we are moving forward. So CBAM. But the thing about CBAM that interests me most is that when this conversation was happening, whether it is the WTO GATT and then WTO conversation and the UNFCCC conversation, there is a certain acceptance that, or an understanding that trade and economic growth were more important than environmental, or this was a smaller price to pay, or I mean, if you prioritize the problems or the goals, the climate goals were not up there. Today, because of the way the climate conversation has changed and it affects every part of the economy, it is actually pushing on trade policy. So we are standing at a moment where climate policy...
Pushing where?
pushing
away or pushing towards?
No, it's pushing as in there is an interaction. It's not two buckets.
Okay.
And it's not two buckets where trade comes on top and climate at the bottom. Climate is impacting trade, or trade is impacting climate. So there is actually, we are at that moment where we have to have a conversation of trade policy that actually acknowledges climate at the same time, and therefore competitive. Because why are we talking about climate in terms of trade policy? Is because of competitiveness, which is what CBAM
I
is
agree
meant to
with
be.
you. Those two conversations are now interlinked.
Interlinked. And therefore, but there is another piece of the puzzle, and that piece of the puzzle is the climate piece, or the UNFCCC piece. Because climate policy, what is climate policy or climate negotiations about? It's about responsibility, and then it evolved to collaboration, however imperfect it is.
Both things, competition and
And
collaboration.
and trade as competition, and at best, what do you call, not collaboration, but definitely complementarity between economies.
Indeed.
How do you get those two conversations together? And to me, that becomes the interesting thing about CBAM. So and as a journalist, I then have the sort of the privilege of looking at both sides of the conversation. I can see the European Union's argument,
yes,
and I can see the Indian argument. The question really is, and I think this is where India needs to be much more pushing the conversation, is how do you address the development question without impinging on the trade question? So how do you bring those two questions together? Do we allow a repeat where the biggest economies actually define the rules again, or are we going to be part of that process? And to me, the carbon market conversation should be located very seriously in that.
Because I see the bottom line as a very simple thing. I agree with you. Cooperation and competition are certainly part of the conversation now together regarding trade. But for the bottom line seems to be the carbon price. Either you have a carbon price through a carbon tax or a carbon price through the market. And that can be easily linked to trade, because if you have revenues from the carbon tax, or you have financial flows through the carbon market, then you can support the industry moving forward. So
that's exactly
the problem
what it should
is the
be.
solution in this case.
Exactly. So maybe we should be approaching the carbon markets question with that larger question, and as developing countries, whether it's and middle income countries. You know, I have this nasty because one has to write for a larger sort of audience, and often write about things that I vaguely comprehend myself, and then I have to write about it as if I understand it all well. So one tends to think about in terms of how would you think about the problem in a manner that's understandable. And on my way here, I was thinking that countries like India, Mexico, middle-income countries which are not at the bottom, but like middle,
yeah, and growing fast.
or low and growing fast, are a bit like, you know, kids with who are called gifted students.
Yeah.
So they're in a class with kids older than them.
Indeed.
So their brain is actually working at a faster pace, but their emotional development is actually their age. So
Okay.
few grades below. How do you marry those two? Because otherwise you're going to have an imbalanced kid. And we see that very often with a lot of kids who go to gifted kids who end up having trouble because the two don't go hand in hand. And I think that's, I mean, I'm sorry, it's a bad analogy, but nonetheless.
No, but it's strong because having the carbon market would allow us to practice.
Exactly.
And practice interaction. Although Mr. Martins was telling us that the mindset is still in the past, in the way we used to do joint implementation under the Kyoto Protocol solution. So in a sense, you are saying the dialogue you would like to see happening is still stuck in the past. Isn't that true?
I wonder which past we're talking about, because I'm fairly old.
The recent past.
So I'm fairly old, and let me say, I remember as a European being let me put it in very blunt terms, cajoled, forced out of a resolution that the EU had made, that the inclusion of aviation under the EU ETS would actually also apply to flights coming in and out of Europe.
Yep.
And that was brutal. The way that decision, we call that decision internally, we call it the stop the clock.
Mm-hmm.
That was announced by then President Barroso of the Commission upon basically having received many calls, or several calls, from manufacturers in the EU who had just been cancelled large
plane.
Exactly. So think about it this way: we've come from that situation, and I totally agree with what you said. We come from a situation where trade was absolutely not to be spoken of, because
sacrosanct.
It is sacrosanct. You have the UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibilities on one hand, and you have the trade framework under the WTO. Never shall the two meet. And suddenly, fast forward several years afterwards, we have the Paris Agreement, and we have a totally different concept of how this interaction, we still don't really know how these things will pan out.
Yeah.
But just listening to the conversation here, this is a much different conversation that we're having here in Mumbai than we would be having maybe 10 years ago when the EU was putting up that essentially that tax. And what I find fascinating is how, because I was on the other side, if you want, of the fence, how we in Europe were thinking about this. When the CBAM was first proposed, it was not seen as a very credible proposal by many experts in the EU. And the reason being, we had that experience of the aviation experience. So we thought, we will never have the cojones to have the we'll never have the balls to go against India and China and, God forbid, the US on this. But we did. And what was interesting was the reaction. The reaction I find very fascinating, because the debate right now that you are having is this. And this is how I would like to see the debate, as a European, would like to see the debate happening, is why should the European Union tax your exports and in a way appropriate the rent, because you will be paying into the European Union coffers, appropriate the rent from that when you could do it yourself
through a carbon market
by instituting a price.
Indeed.
Why give the money to my government, I mean, from Portugal or any European government, when that money can stay here and actually work for your benefit? And I think that's, surprisingly to me, because I hadn't thought of it this way, I think that's how the debate has changed quite significantly.
But if I may, I mean, one of the reasons why, again, I'm like many handshakes removed from all the conversations you were involved in. But as somebody who was writing on the EU ETS and that aviation proposal, one of the big questions was exactly this: why how is it that we are going to subvert everything that we have agreed to under the UNFCCC and actually give money to Europe? It's a reverse flow, and that you hear lingerings of that conversation even now in CBAM. So perhaps that's the other thing that needs to be addressed, but it needs to be addressed as grown-ups and not the way we did that time.
And especially because trade flows are changing all the time. If we think that they are static and we want to protect the current markets, it's not true. The carbon on steel has moved, the carbon on aluminum has moved, and the trade in cars has moved. Yes, just wrap up, and then we'll go with the virtual team. Just so you can prepare certain questions.
Just because we're talking about trade, just very, very quickly, as Juan Carlos knows, I was a consultant with the World Bank in several countries. One of them was Morocco. At one point, I was set in front of the whole cement industry of Morocco. The whole cement industry of Morocco telling me that they couldn't have a carbon price in Morocco, even though 90% of the production, or should I say 90% of the capital and the facilities was of European companies. But if you talk not about cement, but for instance steel in Europe, you're exactly in the situation where you wonder, we're in a globalized economy. We just had Tata Steel today. Tata Steel has huge carbon footprint in Europe. So the idea that we are somehow,
disconnected,
is a bit gone.
Yes, and I think that's the convergence. And probably what is happening is what we saw in the pilot program, in the notional market that all stakeholders and participants carried out, and it's now a publication, is showing you the different ways in which the market can be interacting between actors. And that's a way to speed up. I would love to continue this conversation and having more questions between them, but now I would like to, for the public to begin to raise their hands and begin to ask. Before I do that, I would like to ask our 4 speakers in the virtual world if they would like to comment on anything that has just been said. Small, sharp comment to guide the conversations. And after you do, I'll go to the public here.
If I may, just a very quick one on CBAM. Apologies for the pun. I think the discussions around CBAM have generated a lot more gas than any actual greenhouse gas emission reduction so far. It's important to remember that CBAM, first of all, there's a provisional agreement. There's only going to be a trial period started from October of this year. And even the full implementation that's been talked about from 2026, in reality, its full scope actually comes into effect in 2034, if you look at the text that has been written. And when we looked at the trade that this impacts, even the trade between India and EU, while certainly it does have some impact on the steel trade, as it was mentioned again, it's mostly about the companies that are in Europe to make sure that their competitiveness from a carbon perspective is actually equal. So from the perspective of the concerns around emerging markets trade with EU, to be honest, when we look at the trade volumes and how much this directly impacts it, it's relatively limited. It's not a significant issue. So the concern that I have is actually there's a lot of political capital being spent on sort of discussing this topic, whereas in reality, we should step back and look at the fundamental challenge that we have. Going back to how Dr. Arredondo started us with the objective, the reason we need carbon pricing in any economy is because in most economies, carbon as an externality is not being accounted for. So I think it's important to recognize that whether we have a carbon market or a carbon tax or CBAM mechanism, it's really fundamentally how do we ensure this externality is reflected in our economies so that we can actually tackle the emission question.
Yep, and I agree. Having a sensible carbon market in India would allow this carbon price to emerge, and then the discussions on technology investment can keep on unencumbered by threats or risks in the horizon. And indeed, having such an ambitious plan as India's new NDC will require some kind of signal that says, if you do this early, if you make a transition early, the amount of allocations that you will be able to sell in the market will help you finance whatever you invest now today. So it's a story about carbon finance through the carbon market. Any of the Ms. Aurora, Juan Carlos, Ms. Acharya, would you like to make a final comment before we go to the public's questions?
No, it's fine. I'd love to hear what kind of questions the audience has.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so please raise your hand, and if there are any questions in the chat, would Ulka or my team members from WRI-India help me out and speak for the ones who are silent? Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Abhay Veer Singh from Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai. So my question is that like a lot of emphasis is being given on CBAN, and on the same hand, there is this lot of pressure of just transition. So how do we equate the two? Because I feel that when it comes to the developed countries, all the manufacturing industries, they are being shifted to the developing countries, and I think this will make the vulnerable population more vulnerable. So that's what I wanted to ask.
Anyone wants to take that one, or shall I?
Maybe a comment on that. Thank you very much for the question. I think the practical aspect of what we have been talking about is what is implication for India. And if we start with CBAN, which is what we discuss now, is Indian companies have started to look into their own emissions profile, particularly those who are exposed precisely to exporting their products to Europe, whatever the country in Europe. So there is an emergence of that practice. They want to know how much they are emitting, and they want to calculate how much carbon content goes into that products. That triggers a next question for them, which is how they can reduce their emissions, even in the absence of a carbon pricing. How can they do that? And within that, exploring the mitigation options comes precisely the important topic on how can I do that, decarbonize to some extent, without cutting jobs, without creating an unharmful environment. How can I reduce my emissions supporting just transition? Because the whole process of decarbonization, not just of a single company, but if we start to think about sectors and economy as a whole, implies that some sectors may reduce some activities, people may be losing jobs, and some other sectors may emerge. But you need to have the capabilities, the skills in the workforce. I mean, people should know about what are the skills that they may need for those new economic activities. So the whole process of decarbonization as a whole, then, looking at from a broader perspective, implies that you have to take into consideration just transition. And the importance of, in this case, the Indian government and the Indian companies is how you can create a mechanism that puts a price on carbon that triggers those actions systematically over time, for you to estimate emissions, for you to look for your options, for you to undertake them to decarbonize, and for you to take due care about creating jobs and not just losing jobs in a large segment of the population.
And I would add that you also need an actor here that we have not spoken of, which are unions, worker unions, because they will be part of those large firms, and they are the ones who will have to adapt to the new technologies, to the new practices, to the new shifting of type of activities. And in some sectors, it might be easy. The same team of persons that build a fossil fuel-based car will be the same team that does for an electric vehicle. But we have to be conscious of where they are, what the possible technological transitions we will see, and then get them involved, because that idea of retraining into the new technologies, repositioning them in the sectors that will grow, will not be easy if we do nothing. If we have them involved, governments, firms, and unions working together to find a good way to make this smooth happen and fast towards greener technologies, will be the key.
If I may, sorry.
In any order you want.
Just because it was a compliment to what Juan Carlos was saying, I was just going to compliment that another link between carbon pricing and just transition is if you know, and I think at least it's my belief, that we are going to face an energy transition, and it's going to be massive across the world. We're already seeing it. We need finance to accommodate that just transition, and that's where carbon pricing can actually be used.
Love
and
it.
has been used with, for instance, using revenues from ETS or using carbon tax revenues.
The thing I was going to say is this, is that one of the things we forget is that India is growing at a fast clip. It's the 5th largest economy. If you remember a few days ago, there were stories in the paper about India wanting to become the 3rd largest in several years' time. So your economy, the economy is going to grow, and if you do not start pricing carbon and factoring that in, you're going to be in a whole lot of trouble, because this is a different world from the one in which the EU ETS for aviation came in or was proposed. It's a world where we all are responsible for reducing emissions. And the other thing to learn, like we learned from our solar venture on domestic content, the other thing to learn is the whole exercise of globalization, where those industries moved away from these markets, which is what they're trying to avoid now in the form of carbon leakage, avoiding carbon leakage. You don't want a situation where your economy's growth will get stymied because you haven't price this externality.
Correct.
So therefore, yes, there is a political conversation about who should be paying, and that big political question that never gets resolved and will unlikely ever will. But we should keep having it. But the point is that we can't just have it. You have to act, because the world is changing, and like it or not, we are part of that change.
Okay, great. So it means looking forward and looking in advance, saying we need help in this. Well, there were other hands raised. I'm not sure what was the order. Let me get one in the back, then one in the middle, and one in front. Let's go for the middle. And then on the front, and then on the back.
With this carbon credit and carbon tax levied by the developed countries on the underdeveloping countries.
I know each country makes its own taxes. Yeah. So you're saying about the
now, what is the role and responsibility of developed countries in technology transfer in reducing the carbon emissions to the underdeveloped countries? That is one question mark. Second is it that I am the big brother and I will squeeze the poorer countries? Is it that?
You want to?
Yeah. I mean, this is a conversation, as I said, the one we'll have till eternity.
Sure.
But the problem is this, is that, you have, as I see it, and I'm no expert, but as I see it, you have two options. Either you get squeezed, or you sit at the table and say, hey, this is what I have a plan for, which also understands from where you are coming, which is the global problem, but these are my needs. And for that, the carbon market is one way of, saying, I'm at the table, let's have this conversation. It is not a one-way street. If you are the 5th largest economy, there's somebody else, and it does happen. Anybody who's gone to a COP or follows the COP will know about, poorer countries, the least developed countries, some small island states actually saying India should pay into the coffers. So somebody is actually also saying that you are squeezing the poor. So basically, I would say enlightened self-interest should get you at the table so that you are part of the rule-making rather than just being at the receiving end. But that's how I understand it.
I think it's a complete response. Great.
Maybe a comment on that very quickly, because it is very important to have this clear for the audience. The Paris Agreement allows for cooperation among countries, and including the possibility of technology transfer in relation to the mitigation or adaptation activities that you want to undertake. India, in particular, it has already defined where the cooperation wants to be. Now, the Ministry for Environment, Forestry and Climate Change has already published a list of 13 different sectors or activities, mostly related to energy, in which they want to engage with international cooperation under the Paris Agreement. So that's already decided. So we can expect for these discussions on technology transfer and responsibilities to happen in the context of the Paris Agreement, at least with these 13 different activities in India.
And if the group finds there's a 14th or 15th sector that has not been slotted, it's now is the time to begin to put that into the agenda. To keep the conversation flowing here and then back there.
Yeah, my name is Asmat. I am part of Estamia, which is developing a marketplace for sustainable products for conscious buyers. The question that I have for you people is, currently I have just been noticing that mostly companies are the one which are either coming under the policies, and we are talking more about framing policies for the company so that we move towards a greener world and become more sustainable. But since we were also developing a product, I had a chance to speak to consumers directly, and many of the consumers are saying that they don't even are aware of it. So they are like, they want a sustainable product, but since the economy is such that no one talks about it, it's not even the corporate's responsibility alone to give products. Ultimately, it is the buyer. So corporates are producing products based on what consumption demands are. So if consumers themselves are not aware that they have to buy and choose products which are more sustainable, then ultimately as a business person, I would definitely want to meet that demand and give that to the market. So shouldn't we also try to have policies around
consumers?
Consumers, because consumers are the bottom line. If they make a demand for products which are sustainable in nature and switch to such products, then it pushes the economy as a whole.
I agree that that's a connection. Ms. Acharya, Ms. Arora, would you like to answer that one?
Let me try and take that. I know this is a question that we should really be having many more discussions on, because unless we have all of us involved and in our daily lives, it's going to be that much harder. Two things. At the technical level, there are discussions out there on what's called Scope 3 emissions. In other words, if you're a company and you've got a greenhouse gas target that you've taken voluntarily or somebody has put it on you, largely your shareholders, many companies are struggling with where they stop counting. And we don't have an international benchmark, let alone a domestic benchmark on where everybody should stop counting. If we did have that, then, and if we did have that and that international benchmark said, well, my quote unquote Scope 3, those are emissions from my value chain and so on, then you will naturally have companies either selling you a more sustainable and cheaper product so that a consumer would buy it. The consumer would definitely know about it because the company would try and tell the consumer this is so much better. And you combine that with the second piece is a national awareness campaign. We have the beginnings of it in India. We had some of it through quote unquote what was called or what is still called the Swachh Bharat initiative. It's a big campaign to keep your place clean. There's a new campaign that is starting called Life, the Lifestyle for Environment. It is just about started, but if you had something like that merged with a large scale nudging exercise, perhaps we'd all come out in a better place, that you and I would in fact ask for a more sustainable product or a more sustainable alternative. Or you and I would be more informed about our choices. Today, if I buy an electric car, people are still asking me whether it is in fact greener than the diesel alternative or the petrol. Why are we still having those conversations? Yes, there's some portion that's left, but we shouldn't really be having this conversation anymore at all. So, it's a really good question, and I would urge you and ask and hope that we are able to have these discussions around this is where consumer-based awareness has to come in. And it will come in through policy and through, I would say, just having some sort of an international benchmark on where do you stop your counting.
And I would say that the power of prices grows when there is more information. So if the prices change thanks to the market, the carbon market or the carbon taxes, and an electric scooter is cheaper than a fossil fuel-based scooter, then it will be not only the price, but the information, and both things have the power to change faster. Let me get one question back there, and we'll be wrapping up because we are enjoying the time, but then our virtual speakers will have to leave soon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kaustubh. I represent the Global Cement and Concrete Association, the hard-to-abate sector. My question to all panelists, before that I must thank them for their wonderful thoughts and really added value to my understanding at least. My question is, as we move to a new carbon market regime, in the short term, whether it is a risk to the hard-to-abate sector or an opportunity, and why?
Ms. Aurora, would you like to discuss that? Take that one?
Sure. And before that, I just want to add to the last conversation, if I may. I think a very important point raised and very well answered by Marwa. I just want to add that I think government is the biggest consumer and biggest procurer. And governments need to have proper policies, procurement policies, which are going to pull these more sustainable products. We are seeing this in the case of EVs. You can see governments after governments in India saying they want to procure EV, and that's changing the entire ecosystem. Similarly, if they were to do for other things, this will change the entire ecosystem. So I think we need to take that power of procurement that governments have also to leverage that a bit more. Coming to this question that was asked, I think it's really I'm an optimist, so it's an opportunity. I think it is something that we must capitalize on. It's an opportunity. It would be probably for probably a mid-sized company, maybe a little bit more difficult, but for large companies, it's certainly an opportunity which they should be taking on. They anyways have to do this. The writing is on the wall. If any company thinks that they can, postpone this journey of transition and decarbonizing for another 2 decades or something, I think they're in some different world. It's already there in their face. Therefore, the carbon market would allow you to do this, as well as see if you can get some incentives out of the market if the market evolves. And the more we participate in it, more we have the chance of making the market mature and getting the fruits out of the market. And of course, as was discussed, first is our own domestic market and our own objectives. But if we can over a period of time mature it and interconnect it through the the Paris Agreement mechanisms and the Article 6, etc., then you have the larger ability to leverage the international market. So I think overall a plus. It will be initial teething troubles, but I think hard to abate sectors need not worry. They have done the pact. So in India, I think we should feel a little more confident. Would be my answer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. I would complement what Ms. Aurora said, that the power of consumers, individuals, governments, but also firms. And despite that, from the news from the US are mostly about the subsidies and tax breaks, etc., one of the most interesting elements is the advance purchase agreements. And this is a way in which a set of firms say, I would purchase the new low-carbon cement or the low-carbon steel or the low-carbon X. I would purchase, if you can generate this in 5 years, I will put forward bill that says I will buy 1,000 or 1 million units of this. This idea of connecting this with the private sector with advanced purchase agreements for the emerging technologies, which are still with uncertainty, we don't know if there will come out as super champion or normal or be flops. Whatever happens, if they are successful, then there will be some purchases. So I think we should be thinking also in that role. A carbon market is just a way to organize interactions. And this is probably what we should be thinking in India here. And I am afraid that we are very close to our time. And we had some questions over in the chat. They have been answered or they are similar. I would like to ask for final remarks, any final remarks from any of our speakers. 1 or 2 phrases that you think would give us pointers for the next few weeks and months of discussions. I like that thoughtful stare from you.
I'll go first if you allow me.
Yeah, please.
I have 2 thoughts. One is a suggestion.
I think we lost you.
A while, and I don't know if anybody's done this exercise. It goes back to your very first question, where the lingering question on people's minds in government is, where will India come out as far as trading is concerned? If I were to trade domestically versus if I would trade with the outside world, if I were to do 6.2 and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. The answer to that lies in some sort of fairly heavy modeling. And I'm not sure we have a consensus around input costs, consensus around abatement costs internationally and vis-a-vis India. If this is something you can
I don't think we need that, because precisely carbon markets are a way to tease out that information. We don't have to already know what
No,
the
there
winners
is
are
a-
and bet on the winners. The market will tell us who the winners are.
I think there is a sense inside the system that there are two ways. You can wait and be opportunistic and see where the market settles, but then that answer settles on an already designed economic system, as opposed to where I want to go. And accordingly, a carbon market will allow me to get there or not. And to what extent do I say this is on the margins, I don't care? And to what extent do I make a concerted effort to combine the carbon market for financial income to make the energy transition? I think the latter is a question that is there, and that latent need is there. If this is something you could take on, I think there's a lot of appetite for it. There's a lot of funding for it that can be organized. The other thing is, whenever we have a carbon market, it will probably remain fairly opportunistic for as long as our energy policy in the country is not an integrated one. Today, our energy policy is, we've got something for wind, something for solar, something for oil and gas, something for petroleum, something. And for as long as we have that system, to make interfuel substitution is going to be a difficult call. And that's what we'll need to do more and more of in terms of the energy transition. So to that extent, wherever we come out on a carbon price and a carbon market, today we're picking sectors, but it's good to pick sectors. It's good to pick sectors. But we also just make sure that the energy policy itself needs to come back together.
I get
So this
your
is
point.
something that would...
I get your point, which is the carbon pricing that will emerge from the market or from taxes will be just the beginning. Because once the signal is out there, the response by industrial sectors will require this coordination. And that is probably the agenda you are setting forward. I would like to end up with this, because it's the agenda of starting with prices, the signals come in, how do we coordinate the next steps forward? And in that coordination and that discussion, we would love to still you have here as public, interacting with WRI-India and with the network in general, and with all the sectors involved. With this, thank you very much to all our speakers, and thank you for being on such different time zones and sharing your best ideas and your best questions forward. Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm here to close, all right, and I'll not stand for a very long amount of time here. So allow me to start by congratulating the research team of WRI-India, who basically come up with this very timely report on leveraging carbon markets for cost-efficient emission reductions in India. So congratulations, Ashwini, Varun, Shubhangi. We have other colleagues who are not no longer the part of WRI-India, but I'd like to mention their name, Megha and Tejaswini. I'd also like to thank our distinguished speakers for driving such interesting sessions on effective carbon market design and international perspective towards a new global market regime. There are a lot of takeaways from the two sessions, the morning session and the afternoon session, but I'd like to focus on just two key takeaways that really stood out for me. One is obviously the capacity building, because it's very important to build the capacity of various stakeholders in relevant sectors to sort of bring in more players into the carbon market, including the MSME sectors. And the second one is the decarbonization obviously will come with a cost, and it is undeniable. It really pays to be environmentally friendly. So if we want more players, and more so, MSMEs, I think we need to make a business case for them as to why it is important for them to participate in the carbon market. As a next step, we will develop and share the key findings from today's sessions with the relevant stakeholders. And we also plan to develop a capacity building program. However, we don't think that we can do it alone. We would require the support from the industries, from industry associations, regulators, and other relevant stakeholders. Last but not the least, I would like to thank CII, Confederation of Indian Industry, Business 20 and Think 20 Secretariat. I'd also like to thank Bureau of Energy Efficiency for their leadership and leadership in developing the contours and the overall framework of Indian carbon market. Special thanks to the companies who have participated in the simulation exercise. And last but not the least, I'd like to thank MacArthur Foundation for their continued support. Thank you so much. Please join us for the tea.